We are in Alexandria, 69 BCE, the city that dreamed it was the center of the world, and for a time it was right. Here marble streets gleam beneath the sun. Greek poets debate near Egyptian priests. Merchants from Nubia, India, and Rome bargain beneath striped awnings. And beyond them, at the end of the royal harbor, the Pharaoh's lighthouse cuts a white spear into the blue horizon, a monument so tall sailors swear it touches the clouds. Within those palace walls of alabaster and gold, a newborn cries. The attendants bow low. The midwives murmur blessings in two languages, Greek for intellect, Egyptian for eternity. The baby's name will echo across millennia. Cleopatra VII, Philopator, the glory of her father who loves his people. She is born a princess, yes, but also a paradox, the last flower of a Greek dynasty rooted in Egyptian soil. Her lineage reaches back 3 centuries to Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's generals, who carved Egypt for himself after Alexander's death. The Ptolemies ruled as pharaohs, but spoke Greek at dinner and quoted Aristotle between mouthfuls of honeyed dates. They built temples for Isis, yes, but inscribed the walls with Greek letters. Their Egypt was a fusion of 2 worlds, glorious and uneasy, where philosophy shared space with incense, and where statues of Athena and Bastet stood shoulder to shoulder in the same courtyards. Little Cleopatra would inherit this contradiction like a birthright. Her cradle was carved from cedar, shipped from Lebanon, inlaid with lapis and gold. Above it hung a mobile of miniature planets, a gift from the palace astronomer, who promised the queen that the child was born under an auspicious conjunction of Venus and Sirius. The stars, he said, favored her. They often say that about royal babies, but this time the stars may have actually listened. In those early months, her father, Ptolemy Auletes, the flute player, strolled the corridors, humming nervously, a man who preferred music to governing. He adored Greek theater, adored wine, adored Rome a little too much, and was adored by almost no one in return. The court whispered that Egypt's real ruler was its debt to Roman creditors. Outside the palace, grain riots flared. Inside, the king soothed himself by commissioning new statues of himself, all slightly thinner than he was in real life. Amid that unstable glitter, Cleopatra's education began, before she could even walk. A nurse whispered lullabies in Egyptian. A tutor recited Homeric verses in Greek. Her earliest toys were small figurines of gods, Osiris, Isis, Horus, and a miniature scroll that unrolled into nonsense scribbles. She chewed on both indifferently. From the start, she belonged to neither world completely, and so she learned to belong to both. By the time she could form words, she spoke them in several tongues. Her first steps were taken under ceilings, painted with constellations. Her first lessons delivered by scholars who measured the world in stars' geometry and the price of grain. Picture her, toddling between shelves of the great library, trailing behind her father's scribes, who carried scrolls the way modern interns carry lattes. Somewhere among those endless papyrus rolls, mathematics from Alexandria, medicine from India, philosophy from Athens, something in her small mind must have awakened the sense that knowledge itself could be a kind of power. Outside, Alexandria pulsed like a living organism. Its harbor thrummed with oars, its streets smelled of cedar oil and camel sweat, and every voice carried a different accent. To grow up here was to inhale the entire Mediterranean. While other children of the ancient world learned the geography of a single valley or island, Cleopatra learned a map that stretched from Spain to Syria, from the cataracts of the Nile to the marble hills of Athens. Historians later claimed she was the most educated woman of her age, but that sounds too clinical for what she truly was. She was curious, dangerously so. If a fisherman arrived at the docks, With an unfamiliar catch, she'd pester him for details. If a mathematician demonstrated a new theorem, she'd demand to see the proof. If a visiting Roman senator boasted about his republic, she'd politely dismantle his argument before dessert. Her world, however, was not all marble and scrolls. The Ptolemaic court was a nest of vipers, where poison often replaced politics. Brothers married sisters not from romance, but from fear. Each family dinner a rehearsal for potential civil war. The flute-playing king had enemies on every balcony. Assassins disguised as servants drifted through the corridors like incense smoke. Cleopatra's nurse once found a scorpion in her cradle, a warning or an omen, no one could tell. Perhaps both. And yet amid this treachery, the child thrived. She learned to read faces as others read hieroglyphs, a twitch of an eyebrow, a shift in tone, the tiny pause before a lie. The skill would one day save her crown more than any army. Outside the palace, Egypt itself breathed according to the rhythm of the Nile. Each year, the flood rose and fell, blessing or punishing, depending on the god's moods. From her window, young Cleopatra watched barges drift downriver, loaded with wheat, bound for Rome, watched peasants sing hymns to Happy the river spirit, and began to grasp a truth that her Greek ancestors had never quite understood. Egypt's real sovereign was water. Whoever mastered its flow ruled the land. At dusk, when the desert wind carried the smell of wet earth, she would wander with her attendants through the royal gardens. Papyrus rustled lotus blossoms closed for the night, and statues of forgotten kings glowed pale under moonlight. Somewhere in that twilight world of myth and marble, the girl began to sense her destiny. Because even then, at 5, maybe 6, she understood something that would define her life, that power was not inherited. It was learned, observed, earned. That beauty faded, but intellect endured. That the gods favored those who paid attention. So as torches flickered along the palace walls, and the city settled into its nocturnal hum of laughter and distant music, the small figure of Cleopatra leaned against a balcony, eyes wide, absorbing everything, the city lights on the water, the songs, the shadows. 2 worlds, Greek and Egyptian, converged in her heartbeat. She was not yet the queen of the Nile, just a curious child watching the river that would one day carry her name into eternity. The palace at Alexandria was a maze of brilliance and deceit. Corridors lined with philosophers and politicians, each convinced they were the cleverest in the room. In one marble hall, scholars debated the motion of the planets. In another, priests performed rituals to ensure those planets didn't crash into each other out of divine irritation. For a young Cleopatra, this wasn't chaos, it was curriculum. By the time she could hold a stylus properly, her tutors had already decided she was exceptional. Her lessons began at dawn, when the first light struck the marble courtyards and ended long after the oil lamps burned low. Mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric, astronomy, medicine, all filtered through the sharp, eager mind of a girl who refused to learn merely for form's sake. She didn't memorize. She questioned. If the Nile floods because of the stars, she once asked a startled priest, "Why do the stars not flood for us?" The old man never quite recovered. Education in the Ptolemaic court wasn't simply intellectual, it was theatrical. Every moment was a rehearsal for power. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XIII, liked to stage diplomatic dinners, where Greek scholars, Roman envoys, and Egyptian priests would all attempt to flatter him at once, usually in different languages. Cleopatra, a silent observer at these banquets, would sit behind a column or beside a harpist listening. She watched how each man's tone shifted with his company. She noticed how promises were given like gifts, how threats could sound like compliments, and how everyone seemed to underestimate the quiet girl in the corner. But Cleopatra didn't only learn from polished debates. She learned from the palace's quieter corners, the servants' halls, the gardens, the library courtyards. From cooks, she learned about trade routes, where the cinnamon came from, why the pepper was late, what rumors had sailed with the grain ships. From guards, she learned about morale and loyalty. From slaves, she learned about suffering lessons that no royal tutor could teach, but that would one day make her reign unlike any of her predecessors. The great library of Alexandria became her second home. Imagine its long colonnades filled with dust motes glowing like suspended stars. Tens of thousands of papyrus scrolls, each containing the thoughts of men who had dared to ask why. Greek, Egyptian, Persian, Babylonian, Sanskrit, it was the internet of the ancient world, only quieter and with a slightly higher risk of fire. Cleopatra would spend hours there, perched on a cushioned bench, reading not what she was told to read, but whatever caught her curiosity. Anatomy, navigation, poetry, the logic of Aristotle, the geometry of Euclid, the medicine of Hippocrates. Her tutors grew uneasy. A princess who studied medicine unseemly. A girl who calculated naval distances suspicious. But her father, for all his musical foolishness, recognized something rare in her. Perhaps he saw a chance for redemption through his daughter, a ruler who might finally unite the two worlds he himself never could. So he indulged her. And so the girl grew up among scrolls and shadows, scrolls filled with knowledge, shadows filled with whispers. Alexandria was a city that glittered on the surface, but seethed underneath. The royal family's finances were tangled hopelessly with Roman debts. The priests of Egypt resented their Greek overlords. The merchants resented the taxes that fed the palace. And through all of it, young Cleopatra listened. Listening, she learned the music of politics, the rhythm of fear, the melody of ambition, the silence of those who dared not speak. Some nights, she wandered the palace alone. Her sandals echoed softly across mosaic floors, depicting scenes of the gods, Isis nursing Horus Athena, raising her spear. The oil lamps cast rippling halos across the walls so that the painted figures seemed to breathe. Cleopatra would pause before the statue of Isis and whisper questions, not prayers, but curiosities. What is power really? She might have asked. Is it the crown or the people who believe in it? If the goddess answered, she kept the secret well. Outside, Alexandria's harbor glittered with ships from every known land. Even from her balcony, Cleopatra could recognize the flags, Phoenician traders, Roman merchants, Greek philosophers, fleeing home politics. She began to see Egypt not as an isolated kingdom, but as the crossroads of the world, pulsing with opportunity and danger. The Nile brought life. Rome brought hunger. Both had to be managed carefully. Her father's rule grew weaker by the year. He bought Roman loyalty with Egyptian gold, then borrowed more when the gold ran out. Inside the palace, rival factions schemed over what would happen when he died. Cleopatra, still barely a teenager, found herself quietly taking mental notes, which courtiers lied easily, which soldiers followed orders without question, which priests could be bribed with silver, which with flattery. She didn't need to draw a map of power. She was already living inside one. And yet amid all this political quicksand, she found time for joy. The palace gardens were her refuge: palm trees, papyrus pools, fountains that sang to the desert wind. There she could laugh freely, recite poetry, or debate philosophy with her tutors, while peacocks strutted in the background like opinionated courtiers. Sometimes she joined the astronomers on the palace roof, charting constellations that had guided Egyptian farmers for 3,000 years. When one scholar pointed out Venus, and called it the goddess of love, Cleopatra smirked and replied, or perhaps the goddess of persuasion. Even at 14, she understood that hearts and minds were connected by invisible strings. But shadows grew longer. Whispers spread of unrest beyond the palace walls of Rome's growing appetite for Egypt's grain and gold. The young princess began to understand that her education was not simply privilege, it was preparation. Every number she memorized, every map she studied, every foreign word she mastered would someday become a weapon sharper than any blade. As the city slept, Cleopatra's candle burned long into the night. Scrolls piled around her, the air heavy with ink and ambition. Outside, the eternal Nile flowed silently beneath the stars, carrying reflections of both Greek and Egyptian heavens, two skies, two worlds. And in that fragile balance, a queen was forming. By the time Cleopatra reached her mid-teens, she had become a phenomenon within her own palace, not just admired, but quietly feared. Courtiers whispered that she could charm a snake or silence a senator with the same smile. Scholars from Athens argued over which language she thought in. It was a fair question. The girl, who would one day speak to emperors, had already made language itself her throne. The ancient world was a mosaic of tongues, each one a passport into another people's trust. Greek ruled the Mediterranean's intellect. Latin ruled its armies. Egyptian ruled its gods. Most of Cleopatra's ancestors never bothered to learn the last one. They considered the language of hieroglyphs and hymnals beneath them fit for priests, not kings. But Cleopatra wasn't content to play the aloof Hellenic monarch. She was something far rarer, a ruler who wanted to be understood by her subjects. So she learned Egyptian, really learned it. She could recite prayers to Isis and argue with tax farmers in the vernacular of the markets. Her voice carried the rhythm of the Nile itself, and the people adored her for it. To them, she wasn't merely another Greek seated on Pharaoh's throne. She was a daughter of Egypt returned after centuries of foreign rule. It was a brilliant political maneuver disguised as empathy, or perhaps empathy disguised as politics. With Cleopatra, it was always both. But she didn't stop there. Her tutors taught her Latin, though they could hardly keep up. She picked up Hebrew from Jewish scholars in Alexandria's bustling quarter, Aramaic from Syrian traders, even a few phrases of Ethiopian. By 16, she could converse fluently in more languages than most modern diplomats dream of learning. Words she once told a stunned Greek philosopher are the only armies a woman may command without bloodshed. He nodded solemnly and probably wrote that down, immediately claiming it as his own. Cleopatra's fascination with communication went deeper than vocabulary. She studied rhetoric, the art of persuasion, with the same discipline a warrior brings to swordplay. She memorized Demosthenes, practiced gesture and cadence before polished bronze mirrors, and learned to use silence like punctuation. She understood that a pause well-timed could conquer a room faster than a declaration. Her father's court provided an endless stage for rehearsal. Senators from Rome arrived daily, each convinced Egypt existed to fund their next campaign. Cleopatra watched them haggle and flatter insult and beg often in the same sentence. She'd listen quietly sometimes, interpreting for her father when the Latin grew too tangled for him. They thought it amusing until she began answering back in perfect Roman diction. That tended to sober them up. Behind her calm poise, the young princess was taking notes, not just of language, but of behavior. She noticed how the Romans often mistook courtesy for weakness, how Greeks assumed philosophy excused arrogance, how Egyptians bowed not only from reverence, but from habit. Each culture revealed its secret pressure points. To Cleopatra, these weren't random quirks. They were keys. Sometimes she'd test them. One afternoon during a reception, A Roman envoy mocked Egyptian religion as superstition. Cleopatra, smiling, replied in flawless Latin, "Then perhaps your gods are simply jealous. They do not require mathematics." The room froze. Even her father stopped strumming his beloved flute. The envoy laughed nervously, and Cleopatra curtsied as if she hadn't just dismantled Roman pride in a single sentence. Her tutors didn't know whether to scold or applaud, but Ptolemy XIII was delighted. "She will outtalk the Senate itself," he bragged later, and he wasn't entirely joking. Yet for all her wit, Cleopatra understood that words could only work if people believed them. So she studied people, their faces, their silences, the emotional dialect that crossed every border. A merchant's hesitation before naming a price. A senator's glance at a companion before agreeing to terms. She practiced mirroring others' gestures to gain trust, a skill modern psychologists would later call empathic attunement. To Cleopatra, it was instinct. When she wasn't studying diplomacy, she devoured poetry. She translated fragments from Sappho into Egyptian and back again, experimenting with rhythm and meaning. She found that language could be more than communication. It could be enchantment. In her hands, words became music. That same cadence would later make generals weep, philosophers follow, and emperors listen when all others spoke in vain. Outside the palace, Alexandria was itself a symphony of tongues, docks buzzing with dozens of accents, markets echoing with shouts of fresh figs in Greek Egyptian and something halfway between. Walking through it was like moving through living language. Cleopatra often wandered there, incognito, wrapped in a simple linen shawl, listening to the chatter. When a baker complained about taxes or a sailor cursed the harbor tariffs, she memorized their phrasing. Later in private council, she repeated those phrases word for word. It startled her ministers. How they'd ask, "Does the queen know what's spoken in the streets?" She'd only smile. Every conversation, every dialect she mastered became another thread in the web she was quietly spinning. Even as her father's reign stumbled under Roman debts, Cleopatra was preparing, absorbing knowledge like a sponge, collecting human insight like pearls. The courtiers saw a girl with books. History would see a strategist training for empire. Sometimes at night she'd walk the balconies overlooking the harbor, where the lighthouse's beams swept across the sea. The air smelled of myrrh and brine, and distant voices carried through the wind. Greek laughter, Egyptian songs, Latin curses. The blend sounded chaotic to most ears. To Cleopatra, it was harmony, the music of the world she would one day rule. Somewhere in that luminous confusion, a thought crystallized that if she could speak to everyone, she could rule anyone. Empires might rise by force, but they endured by persuasion. And words, unlike armies, could cross oceans without bleeding. So, she stood there beneath the stars, whispering phrases in half a dozen languages, tasting their shapes in her mouth, smiling faintly at the power of sound itself. The palace behind her was silent now, the library dark. But the girl on the balcony was awake, dreaming not of conquest, but of conversation, and perhaps deep down, she knew that in her lifetime, the two would become the same. The world beyond Alexandria was a different classroom, one without marble, without tutors, without polite applause. To most royals, the city's walls were a border. To Cleopatra, they were an invitation. She had studied philosophy, astronomy, and rhetoric, but she wanted to understand something far more elusive, the pulse of Egypt itself. And that, she knew, could only be learned in the open air. So she slipped away from the palace whenever she could, sometimes with a small escort, sometimes disguised as a common traveler, sometimes scandalously alone. The people she met didn't bow or flatter. They didn't quote Plato. They told her about droughts, harvest, trade prices, and temple festivals. It was, in its own way, a conversation as intellectual as any held in the great library. She listened to the farmers, who measured time not in years, but in floods, who spoke of the Nile not as a river, but as a god with moods. When it rose generously, the fields shone emerald and gold. When it faltered, famine stalked the villages. Cleopatra watched how the entire kingdom's fate depended on that annual miracle of water. She saw how priests predicted it through the stars, how scribes recorded it, how engineers built dikes to tame it. And in those long journeys, she began to glimpse a pattern that power flowed through Egypt, just as the Nile did, cyclic, fragile, and entirely dependent on timing. The princess traveled by barge through reed-fringed canals, the air humming with dragonflies and distant songs. Children waved from the banks. Fishermen offered gifts of bread and lotus petals. She learned how the smell of silt could predict the next flood, how the taste of wind changed before a storm. The Nile became her tutor, generous, mysterious, sometimes cruel. At dusk, when her party moored by small villages, Cleopatra would sit by the fire and ask questions that startled the peasants. How much grain did they lose to taxes? Did the overseers treat them fairly? What rumors came downriver from Thebes or Memphis? The people were cautious at first, but her voice, warm, unroyal, disarmed them. She wasn't interrogating. She was listening. And in the glow of firelight, the young princess began to understand what her father never had, that ruling Egypt meant more than surviving Rome. It meant feeding its people. Meanwhile, back in Alexandria, her absence made the courtiers restless. What business had a princess among peasants? But when she returned, her questions cut through the palace like arrows. She demanded reports on irrigation, on grain storage, on trade taxes. She wanted to see maps of canal systems, lists of overseers. It was as if she'd discovered that the kingdom was not a jewel to admire, but a living organism, one that needed careful tending if it were to survive the tightening Roman grip. Her fascination with economics baffled her tutors. "You are meant to charm ambassadors." One of them sighed, "Not accountants." Cleopatra smiled. "An empty treasury," she replied, "is a poor introduction." The man didn't argue. Rome loomed larger each year. Its legions were stationed ever closer, its politicians ever greedier. Cleopatra's father, desperate to keep his throne, borrowed fortunes from Roman lenders, binding Egypt to debts it could never repay. Cleopatra watched these transactions with quiet alarm. She saw how the Republic's senators smiled as they signed agreements that might one day make Egypt theirs. It wasn't conquest by sword, it was conquest by contract. And she swore, even then, that she would never let her country become someone else's account ledger. Still, she was too young to act, but not too young to plan. She kept learning, absorbing, calculating. By now, she had mastered not only languages, but also mathematics, particularly the arithmetic of empire, how tribute turned into leverage, how supply fed armies, how timing ruled diplomacy. Late at night, she would trace numbers in the lamplight, calculating grain yields and tax ratios, like a woman solving a riddle for her nation's future. Her curiosity extended to engineering. When visiting the irrigation works near Memphis, she questioned the foremen until they began addressing her, not as princess, but as colleague. She learned how canals diverted floodwater, how the weight of silt changed the Nile's path, how even a small miscalculation could ruin thousands of acres. She was fascinated. In a world where most rulers saw water as divine, Cleopatra understood it as physics, and that combination of reverence and reason made her formidable long before she wore a crown. She also observed how rumor functioned as Egypt's unofficial postal service. News traveled faster along gossip than papyrus scrolls. She studied how markets could turn panic into policy overnight. When grain prices rose, so did discontent. When gold flowed, so did loyalty. To Cleopatra, these were not random fluctuations. They were equations. Politics, she realized, was economics with better lighting. Her father, meanwhile, played his flute for courtiers as Rome's creditors circled. He loved her, perhaps even trusted her, but could not see the gathering storm. Cleopatra did. Each Roman visitor, merchant envoy, or general brought both opportunity and threat. She welcomed them, politely, offered honeyed wine, listened to their speeches about friendship and alliance, and quietly noted which ones had their eyes on Egypt's harbors, which on its grain, and which on her. Those journeys along the Nile changed her. They stripped away the marble and perfume, the luxury of the palace. They showed her that Egypt was not a concept, but a living, breathing world, a motherland of farmers and scribes, sailors and slaves. A kingdom where prosperity and starvation could trade places in a single season. And in the reflection of the water, Cleopatra saw herself not as a Greek princess, not even as a scholar, but as something new, an Egyptian in spirit, a strategist by necessity. At night, as the barge drifted under constellations older than memory, she would look up and feel the hum of destiny, faint, thrilling, terrifying. Somewhere between the stars of Isis and the reflection of torchlight on the current, she began to understand that the Nile and she were alike, both ancient, both unpredictable, both essential. And so, when the barge turned back toward Alexandria and the Pharaoh's lighthouse came into view, her decision was already made. She would not be her father's daughter, a ruler who bowed to Rome. She would be Egypt's daughter, the voice of its people, the guardian of its river, the woman who learned to read not just scrolls, but souls. The palace awaited its marble gleaming in the morning sun. And as she stepped ashore, the servants bowed low, unaware that the curious teenager who returned to them was no longer merely a princess of blood, but a student of destiny. If you'd walked the corridors of the Alexandrian palace in the late 50s BCE, you might have noticed something curious. The laughter had gone quiet. The king, Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XIII, Aulitz had traded music for panic. His debts to Rome had grown monstrous, his charm less effective by the day. And for all the gold Egypt had poured into the Republic's coffers, the Romans now debated whether to keep him or replace him. When Rome sniffed weakness, it didn't hesitate to pounce. The Senate declared Ptolemy an illegitimate ruler, and almost overnight, Egypt's royal court fractured like pottery under strain. The people tired of foreign tribute, and famine rioted. The priests withdrew their blessings. Alexandria's streets filled with chants of "Down with the flute player," not exactly the nickname of a man destined for greatness. Cleopatra, then about 14, watched the collapse unfold, not with fear, but with the analytical calm of someone studying a case study in failure. She saw how loyalty shifted faster than sand underfoot, how gold bought silence but not devotion, and how every ally her father thought he owned was already writing letters to Rome. The girl who had once studied scrolls and stars now studied people in crisis, and what she learned would serve her better than any library. When rebellion finally erupted, Cleopatra stood beside her father as he fled Alexandria under cover of night. They left behind the grand columns, the shimmering harbor, the echoes of a dying dynasty. Their ship cut through black water sails, heavy with damp sea air and regret. Cleopatra stood on deck, gripping the railing eyes, fixed on the receding glow of the Pharaoh's lighthouse, the last beacon of her childhood. She didn't cry. Not once. They sailed for Rome, the reluctant empire, whose appetite they could neither appease nor escape. There, among the marble and corruption, Cleopatra had her true education. The city was enormous, chaotic, magnificent, and utterly convinced of its own immortality. She walked its streets under escort, absorbing everything: the noise of the markets, the swagger of soldiers, the arrogance of senators. Her father, desperate, prostrated himself before Pompey, and the Senate begging to be restored to his throne. Cleopatra watched him debase himself with gifts, promises, and thinly veiled bribes. It was humiliating and instructive. She saw how Rome's power worked, how the Republic disguised greed as diplomacy, how smiles hid daggers. And somewhere, in that foreign city of ambition and intrigue, she made a silent vow: never again would Egypt kneel. Rome, she realized, wasn't strong because of its armies. It was strong because it understood human weakness and monetized it. Senators pretended to serve the Republic, but everyone was for sale. In that sense, Cleopatra thought the Roman Forum was just a grander version of an Alexandrian market. The wares were loyalty, influence, and secrets, and the buyers were men like Pompey and Julius Caesar, names that would soon shape her fate. Cleopatra observed it all like a scholar of empire. At dinner feasts, she listened to orators flatter generals while poisoning their reputations with the next breath. She studied Roman women, their political invisibility, their whispered influence behind closed doors. She recognized something familiar in them: the art of subtle control. But while they used suggestion, Cleopatra would use strategy. The exile years hardened her in ways the palace never could. She learned endurance, patience, and most dangerously of all, perspective. From afar, she saw her homeland not as a set of palaces, but as an entire civilization hanging by a thread. She imagined the Nile continuing to rise and fall without her, the temples still smoking with incense, the people still praying for floods and mercy. Egypt would endure. The question was whether she would be allowed to guide that endurance. When news came that rebellion still consumed Alexandria, her father despaired. Rome offered him conditional help, military support, in exchange for even greater control over Egypt's treasury. He agreed immediately. Cleopatra said nothing, but she remembered. She was learning the first rule of realpolitik: the weak sign treaties. The strong write them. During those Roman years, she spent time in the villas of senators, attending recitations and debates, charming the scholars who found her intellect unsettlingly sharp. Some claimed she reminded them of Sappho. Others, more cautious, avoided her gaze altogether. There was something in her poise, an early glimpse of the woman who would one day face down emperors without flinching. Rome, for all its power, repelled her. Its streets were magnificent but filthy, its morals noble but negotiable. And yet she admired its efficiency, how orders given in the Forum echoed all the way to Spain, Gaul, and Judea. Egypt's bureaucracy was ancient, labyrinthine. Rome's was swift, merciless. Cleopatra understood then that if Egypt wanted to survive, it couldn't simply resist Rome. It had to outthink it. Years passed before the Senate finally agreed to reinstate Ptolemy XII, backed by Roman troops. Cleopatra returned with him, older, wiser, and far less naive. The voyage home was bittersweet. She had left as a child of luxury and returned as a strategist disguised as a daughter. The Nile greeted her like an old friend, calm, ancient, unreadable. Alexandria's skyline shimmered in the distance, the lighthouse standing exactly where she had last seen it, as if mocking the idea that anything had truly changed. But everything had changed. The girl who once recited Homer under the palace trees now carried in her mind the anatomy of empires. She had watched kings beg and senators plot. She had learned that power was never permanent, only negotiated. As her father stepped ashore, the crowd cheered not for him, but for the Roman legions behind him. Cleopatra noticed that too. Egypt was free only by name. But she also noticed something else. The soldiers smiled when they looked at her, and the Roman officers lowered their eyes. Respect, or perhaps intrigue. Either way, it was a beginning. That night, as the palace lamps flickered once more over the waters of the harbor, Cleopatra stood at her balcony, the same one where she had once watched the city as a child. The wind from the sea smelled faintly of smoke and myrrh. She whispered to herself, almost as if rehearsing, never exile again, never dependence again. In that moment, exile ceased to be a punishment. It became her awakening, the crucible that melted away innocence, leaving behind only gold. And while her father's reign would soon collapse into chaos again, Cleopatra's rise had already begun. Quiet, patient, inevitable. The winds of Alexandria carried both incense and fear. Ptolemy VII, the flute player king, had returned to his throne, but his crown was hollow, propped up by Roman spears and bribed loyalty. He was older now, sickly suspicious. He trusted no one, except occasionally his daughter Cleopatra, whose steady mind comforted him, even as her brilliance unsettled him. She was barely 18, but the court had already learned to lower their voices when she passed. She had the same poise as her mother, serene, unreadable, but sharper eyes, the kind that made liars sweat. The palace, once filled with song and laughter, now echoed with murmurs of plots and succession. Everyone knew the king's end was near, and in Egypt the death of a monarch was never simply a funeral. It was an audition for power. Ptolemy's body weakened before his will did. He still attended ceremonies, leaning on gold staffs, smiling for statues, pretending that the Roman friendship he had purchased was genuine. But behind those feasts and processions, he planned feverishly to secure his legacy and his family's survival. He had seen what happened to weak rulers. Their names erased their tombs, defiled their children, exiled or worse. So he turned to Cleopatra. One night, in his private chamber, perfumed with cedar and anxiety, he summoned her. The torches flickered on his tired face as he studied her in silence. Finally, he said, "You are the only one who listens when I speak." It wasn't quite a compliment, more a confession. He spoke of his fears, the Roman creditors, the greedy priests, the fickle generals, and above all, his own family. His younger children were still boys and girls too young to rule. But his eldest son, Ptolemy III, had already been named co-regent, the traditional arrangement of brother-sister rule meant to preserve divine balance. The arrangement also preserved paranoia. Cleopatra nodded silently as her father spoke, knowing full well what it meant. When he died, she would not inherit peace, but a battlefield wrapped in silk. The old king coughed violently, his rings clinking against the couch. When he recovered, he took her hand skeletal cold. "Promise me," he said, "you will keep Egypt whole." She answered softly, "Even if I must fight for it." The king almost smiled. "Then you will." Soon after he died, the palace erupted into the kind of panic only a royal death can produce. Messengers running through marble corridors, priests chanting, slaves scrubbing the floors as if cleanliness could disguise fear. The body was embalmed with myrrh and wrapped in linen. The mourning rites began. But in the shadows of that ritual, grief alliances shifted like sand. According to the will, which Rome naturally had helped to draft, Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy III would rule jointly, husband and wife, as their ancestors had done, at least in name. In practice, it was an impossible arrangement. Cleopatra was intelligent, decisive, and ambitious. Her brother was 13, impulsive, and guided by advisors who saw the young queen as an obstacle between themselves and power. The first months of joint rule were an uneasy dance. Coins were struck bearing both their faces, but Cleopatra's image always shone slightly more regal. Decrees were issued in both names, yet her signature carried the sharper ink. She sat on the throne beside her brother, but spoke all the decisions. It didn't take long for the courtiers around Ptolemy the Thean, particularly his guardian Pothinus and the general Achillas, to notice the imbalance. They began whispering that Cleopatra was too Greek, too independent, too dangerous. She paid little attention. She was already ruling personally, meeting tax officials, reforming grain quotas, even intervening in legal disputes, something unheard of for a woman in her dynasty. Her first act as queen was to stabilize the currency. Her second, to confront corruption in the temples. These were not the gestures of a figurehead. They were the moves of a ruler who intended to stay. But in Alexandria's glittering snake pit, competence is the most unforgivable crime. The court turned. Rumors spread that Cleopatra had bewitched her father into naming her heir, that she disrespected Egyptian tradition, that she was plotting to depose her brother. None of it was true, or rather, it wasn't true yet. By the third year of their joint rule, tensions had sharpened to open hostility. Pothinus and Achillas had taken full control of young Ptolemy the Thean, feeding his vanity and paranoia. Cleopatra's ministers were dismissed or mysteriously lost at sea. Troops loyal to her were reassigned. And one morning, the queen woke to find her name erased from official decrees, her face absent from new coins. The message was clear. Rather than risk a public clash, Cleopatra withdrew from the palace first to the royal estate, then further south to the desert outposts of Thebes. It was an elegant exile, voluntary, strategic. The young queen knew that survival often required retreat, and so for the second time in her life, Cleopatra left Alexandria behind, but this time not as a child fleeing chaos, but as a woman plotting her return. In the silent deserts of Upper Egypt, she found loyal followers among the local priests and commanders who respected her command of language and law. They saw in her not just another Ptolemy, but a reincarnation of Isis, the goddess who protected her people through wisdom rather than force. Cleopatra accepted the comparison, not out of vanity, but out of calculation. If her enemies in Alexandria wielded soldiers, she would wield belief. As months passed, her legend began to grow. Traders spoke of the queen who traveled among the villages, listening to the poor, speaking their language, offering grain during famine. Her enemies scoffed at these stories, but they were stories, and stories have a power no army can fully conquer. From her camp, Cleopatra sent envoys north with letters written in her own hand, sealed with gold promising reform, prosperity, and justice to any noble who would side with her. Some ignored her, others hesitated, but a few quietly, cautiously pledged their loyalty. The civil war had not yet begun, but the desert was already whispering its prophecy. Far away in Alexandria, Pothinus and his circle congratulated themselves on their cleverness, unaware that the woman they had exiled was gathering more than soldiers. She was gathering momentum. And as the hot desert wind rose one evening, carrying the scent of dust and myrrh, Cleopatra stood outside her tent and looked north toward the invisible sea. She could almost see the city lights shimmering beyond the dunes, her city, her throne. "Patience," she murmured, her voice barely louder than the wind. "The Nile always returns." And with that, the exiled queen turned her eyes to the horizon, already planning how to reclaim everything that had been stolen, not just the throne, but the destiny her dying father had asked her to protect. The desert had changed her. By the time Cleopatra returned to the borders of Alexandria, she was no longer the princess who once walked marble halls in silk slippers. She was a commander in linen and dust. Her patience forged in exile, her ambition sharpened like obsidian. She came not as a fugitive, but as a strategist who understood that Egypt could not be ruled by bloodline alone. It needed a mind unafraid of reinvention. Her first years back in power, partial, precarious power, were defined by improvisation. With her brother's faction still entrenched in the palace, Cleopatra operated from the edges, reasserting her claimed city by city, ally by ally. She cut taxes where the harvest had failed, restructured grain shipments, and personally inspected irrigation canals to win back the farmers who fed Egypt. While others plotted coups in candlelit chambers, she rebuilt faith in the daylight. In the towns along the Nile, peasants began whispering again of the queen who spoke their language, who listened, who gave orders with both authority and compassion. In Alexandria, however, her enemies whispered something else entirely, that Cleopatra had gone native, that she dressed as Isis and pretended divinity. They meant it as an insult. She took it as strategy. Because for the first time, Egypt's people truly believed she was one of them. When she appeared in processions veiled in gold linen with the lunar crown of Isis upon her brow, the crowds erupted not with duty, but devotion. Even those who resented her Greek blood found themselves bowing to the living goddess who promised prosperity. The priests of Memphis blessed her, and grain merchants toasted her name. It was political theater of the highest order, but in Cleopatra's performance there was genuine conviction. She didn't just wear Isis, she embodied her. Her court, however, was less forgiving. Letters arrived daily from the advisors of Ptolemy III, demanding her submission. Her refusal was polite, almost gentle, and absolute. The boy king was now 14, surrounded by older men who used his name like a weapon. Cleopatra, barely out of adolescence herself, governed without a husband, without the Senate's approval, without Rome's backing, a woman standing alone in a world allergic to female authority. But solitude suited her. She filled her council with mathematicians, physicians, and translators instead of sycophants. She held audiences in the mornings, personally reviewing petitions from the poor. Some nights, she dined with philosophers and poets, rather than generals, claiming that a sharpened mind keeps a sharper sword. She experimented with new trade treaties to offset Rome's suffocating control. One particularly daring move came in the second year of her reign. She ordered the minting of new silver coinage, bearing only her face, no co-regent, no Roman oversight. It was a declaration written in metal. The message was unmistakable. Cleopatra ruled Egypt, and Egypt belonged to no one else. That coin was both her triumph and her provocation. Pothinus and Achilles, the puppeteers behind her brother, raged that she had overstepped. The Senate in Rome, distracted by its own civil wars, sent no immediate reply. But among the Alexandrian elite, resentment boiled. They accused her of arrogance, of sacrilege, of witchcraft, that last one being the timeless fallback for powerful women. Cleopatra ignored them. She had work to do. Famine had followed a poor Nile flood, and rather than retreat to her palace, she toured the countryside again, this time not as an exile, but as a queen, distributing food from royal granaries. People knelt, not from fear, but gratitude. Old women pressed her hands to their foreheads. Children shouted her name. She was more popular among farmers than nobles, and in Egypt, that meant she was safer among the poor than the powerful. Back in the capital, her enemies conspired to undo her popularity. They painted her as a usurper who had seduced the gods and bewitched the people. Some claimed she mixed poisons in her chambers, others that she whispered spells into the ears of priests. Cleopatra laughed. "If I could truly enchant men," she quipped to her attendants, "we wouldn't be having this conversation." Still, the tension grew unbearable. By the third year of her reign, Alexandria had split in two: Cleopatra's loyalists in the south, Ptolemy's faction in the north. The city of intellect and marble became a chessboard. And like any good player, Cleopatra knew when to move and when to wait. She strengthened her networks along the Nile, consolidating the loyalty of the provinces, while her brother's faction grew arrogant behind the palace walls. She sent envoys to the Sinai frontier, forging quiet friendships with Nabatean traders and desert tribes, the kind who could provide soldiers and silver when the inevitable civil war began. Every night she studied reports by lamplight, the cool breeze from the harbor stirring her hair. Her younger sisters slept. Her generals drank. Her enemies plotted. Cleopatra calculated. She read Roman dispatches intercepted by her spies, learning that Julius Caesar had just defeated Pompey in the Great Roman Civil War. The Republic was fracturing its old alliances, dissolving like salt in water. For Egypt, it was dangerous, but also perfect. Rome was too distracted to intervene. Cleopatra could act without foreign interference, reclaim her capital, and restore her dynasty's independence. But timing was everything. One misstep, one premature move, and she would lose everything. She had learned from her father's mistakes: never rush, never beg, never underestimate the power of appearances. So she played the part of the patient queen, calm amid chaos. She attended rituals, hosted scholars, kept her spies close, and her plans closer. She was alone, yes, but solitude in her hands became focus. Outside, the Nile swelled once more, erasing traces of old drought. The farmers called it a sign from the gods. Cleopatra took it as a promise that cycles could be broken, that ruin could give birth to renewal. In the palace, her enemies toasted their coming victory. In the streets, her name still carried like a prayer. And somewhere between the river and the stars, Cleopatra prepared to step from survival into destiny. The queen stood at her balcony one last time before the storm. Below, torches flickered along the docks, ships rocked in the harbor, and distant thunder rolled in from the sea. She breathed the heavy air, the taste of salt and change on her tongue. "Let them come," she whispered. "I've been waiting." And the wind off the Mediterranean seemed to answer a whisper of rebellion, a promise of reckoning carrying the scent of rain and empire. The storm finally broke. Cleopatra's calm could not outlast her brother's ambition. By 49 BCE, the young king, Ptolemy III, was no longer the timid boy she once guided. He had become the ventriloquist's doll of two dangerous men: Pothinus, the scheming eunuch minister, and Achillas, the ambitious general, who fancied himself Egypt's true savior. Together, they staged what history politely calls a palace coup, though in truth, it was closer to an ambush performed with courtiers' smiles. One morning, Cleopatra awoke to find the gates of her residence sealed, her treasury seized, and her name struck from all decrees. Her statues were quietly removed from the temples her allies arrested. In the official proclamation, she was accused of plotting against her brother husband and corrupting the harmony of the two lands. A poetic way of saying she'd been too competent for comfort. There was no time for elegance. Disguised in plain linen and escorted by a handful of loyal guards, Cleopatra slipped out of Alexandria before sunrise, moving through back alleys while the city still dreamed. She didn't look back at the lighthouse. She knew she would see it again, either in triumph or never. The desert greeted her like an oven. Beyond the fertile valley, the world turned to gold and silence. For days, her small caravan followed the dry spine of the Nile's eastern edge through dunes that glowed like hammered bronze by day and froze under starlight by night. The horses coughed in the dust. The guards spoke little. Cleopatra rode upright, her cloak drawn against the wind, her face steady even when sand stung her eyes. At night, they camped near ruined temples where jackals howled among fallen columns. Her attendants begged her to rest, but Cleopatra spent those hours mapping in her mind, not geography, but strategy, which border garrisons might still be loyal, which priests might dare defy the new regime, which merchants could finance her return. The girl who once studied Euclid now calculated rebellion with the same precision. By the second week, they reached Pelusium, the frontier fortress on the edge of the Sinai. There, Cleopatra's fortunes changed. The garrison commander, an older man who had served her father, knelt before her and swore allegiance. Egypt needs its mind. He said not, its child king. Word spread quickly down the caravan routes the true queen lived. Soon, small bands of soldiers, mercenaries, and Bedouin archers began drifting into her camp, drawn by loyalty, ambition, or simple curiosity. The desert that had seemed empty now bristled with quiet movement, tents sprouting among dunes fires, burning at night like scattered constellations. Cleopatra walked among them, without fear, speaking to every recruit, remembering names, promising fair pay and fertile land. She didn't need to roar authority. It emanated from her composure. Yet even as she gathered strength, she knew time worked against her. Pothinus and Achilles held the capital and the fleet. They controlled the treasury, the grain stores, the propaganda. Her name was being slandered daily in the city squares. She would need more than loyalty and courage. She would need timing and a miracle. That miracle was sailing toward Egypt on Roman sails. Unbeknownst to her, Julius Caesar had just defeated Pompey in the Roman Civil War. Pompey, seeking refuge, had fled to Egypt only to be murdered on Pothinus's orders, his head presented to Caesar as a gift. It was a mistake of monumental stupidity, the kind that only ambitious bureaucrats make when they mistake cruelty for cleverness. Caesar, disgusted, sailed to Alexandria in fury. When Cleopatra received word of his arrival, she understood instantly what her enemies did not. Rome's greatest general had just stepped onto Egyptian soil, furious with the very men who had overthrown her. The gods, it seemed, had a taste for irony. Still, she could not approach him openly. The palace was heavily guarded. Pothinus would never allow her to plead her case. She sat in her tent that night, the desert wind slapping the fabric like a drum, thinking. There was only one way into that palace, quietly, cleverly, and against every rule of royal decorum. Her attendants protested, of course. "You cannot walk into their den," one whispered. "You'll be killed." Cleopatra smiled faintly. "Not if I'm already there before they notice." The plan formed swiftly. She would return to Alexandria in secret, smuggled into the royal quarter by her most trusted servant, Apollodorus. Caesar respected audacity. She would give him a story worth remembering. Before dawn, she dismissed her generals, leaving them orders to hold the border. She dressed simply, her hair braided tight, her eyes fierce with sleepless determination. To the men who knelt before her, she said only, "Wait for my signal. When it comes, you will hear my name again." Then she rode with Apollodorus north toward the sea. The journey took days, nights of sand, and silence of exhaustion and resolve. When at last the lights of Alexandria shimmered on the horizon, Cleopatra felt her heart tighten, not with fear, but with focus. The city that had exiled her glittered like a jeweled serpent waiting to strike. The rest history would later reduce to legend: a queen, a carpet, a Roman, and the turning of empires. But in that moment, as her small boat slipped into the moonlit harbor, Cleopatra wasn't thinking of legend. She was thinking of survival and of opportunity. The desert had stripped her of everything but conviction. And as the waves carried her toward the palace she had once ruled, she whispered a single sentence to the wind, a promise as sharp as a blade: "Let them think they've buried me. Queens do not die in sand. History remembers the moment like theater, and perhaps it was, but Cleopatra wrote the script herself. It was the autumn of 48 BCE. Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul and master of half the Roman world, sat in the royal palace of Alexandria, surrounded by marble incense and chaos. Pompey's severed head had been delivered to him as a gift, and the air still stank of politics and arrogance. The boy king, Ptolemy I, and his regents believed they had impressed him. They couldn't have been more wrong. Into this volatile court sailed a small boat under moonlight. Inside, hidden among bundles of linen, was Cleopatra. After weeks of flight through desert and danger, she had returned to reclaim her throne, and she intended to do it not with armies, but with performance. The palace itself was a labyrinth of columns and guards, every corner glittering with gold and suspicion. Apollodorus, her loyal servant, strode through its courtyards, carrying a rolled carpet, supposedly a gift for the Roman general. The guards laughed, inspected it perfunctorily, and waved him through. The man was strong, but his burden was heavier than they knew inside that rug. Cleopatra lay coiled and silent, her heartbeat matching the drum of the palace fountains. Caesar's chamber was lit with oil lamps, their smoke curling like ghosts. He looked older than she expected, wiry, weathered eyes, like flint, sharpened by campaigns. As Apollodorus placed the rug before him, the Roman raised an eyebrow. A gift from whom, he asked. The answer came not in words, but in movement. The rug unfurled. Linen spilled across the marble floor like waves, and from within it, the queen emerged. Cleopatra rose slowly, wrapped in folds of crimson cloth, her dark hair tumbling loose, her eyes gleaming with exhaustion and humor. From Egypt, she said simply, to Rome. Caesar blinked. The moment stretched. The guards froze. Then laughter, deep and startled. The tension broke like glass. Cleopatra had gambled everything on audacity, and it had worked. What happened next has been embroidered by centuries of storytellers, but even the Romans admitted this. She captivated him. Not by beauty alone, though by all accounts, she possessed that too, but by wit, composure, and the kind of intelligence that makes even conquerors reconsider the definition of power. Caesar had met queens, senators, and orators. None had dared walk straight into danger, wrapped in a rug. They talked for hours. She spoke to him, not as a supplicant, but as an equal, outlining the injustice of her exile, the corruption of her brother's advisors, the dangers to Roman grain supply, should Egypt fall into chaos. It was a pitch worthy of the Senate floor, except softer, more melodic, woven through with charm. She shifted between Greek and Latin, effortlessly quoting Roman poets and Egyptian proverbs, smiling at his surprise. Caesar, for his part, prided himself on reading men. But Cleopatra was no man and no ordinary monarch. She argued like a philosopher, joked like an actress, and watched him with eyes that seemed to weigh his soul. When she asked, "And what does Rome gain if Egypt is ruled by fools?" he found himself answering earnestly. By morning, an alliance had been born, personal, political, and soon enough intimate. Caesar agreed to mediate between the royal siblings, but in truth, the decision had already been made. He would back Cleopatra. Rome needed a stable Egypt, and Cleopatra offered both legitimacy and gratitude. When the news reached Ptolemy I's faction, outrage erupted. The boy king's ministers accused Caesar of betrayal, of being ensnared by Eastern witchcraft. Pothinus hissed that the queen had bewitched him with her eyes. Then perhaps Achilles growled, "We should blind her." Subtlety had never been their strength. Cleopatra, now safely lodged in her old palace quarters under Caesar's protection, watched the turmoil unfold with quiet satisfaction. For once, she was no longer the hunted. Rome's most powerful man had become her shield, and soon her partner. But power came at a price. Caesar's soldiers, though disciplined, were few in number. The Alexandrians, proud and easily provoked, saw them as invaders. Skirmishes broke out near the harbor. Angry crowds shouted Roman insults. Arrows answered from the palace walls. The city, already fractured by civil war, was slipping toward chaos. Through it all, Cleopatra remained unnervingly calm. She met with Caesar daily, discussing not just strategy, but philosophy, trade, even astronomy. He confessed that he admired her intellect more than any Senate debate he'd ever endured. She, in turn, found in him something unexpected, a kindred will, ruthless but visionary. He wanted to reform a decaying republic. She wanted to resurrect a fading kingdom. For a brief, glittering moment, their ambitions aligned perfectly. Outside, the war drums gathered. Inside, the lamps burned late. They dined while the city trembled, plotting not destruction, but reconstruction. And though poets later turned their alliance into a scandal, the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. They understood each other. Two rulers, both accustomed to isolation, suddenly found in the other a mirror and perhaps a warning. One night, as fighting echoed beyond the palace walls, Caesar asked her, half teasing, "Did you know you were walking into danger when you came to me in that carpet?" She smiled. "I never walk into danger, Caesar. I carry it with me." He laughed, but he also remembered the words. Years later, in the chaos of his own downfall, he would think of that girl queen and the audacity that had once revived both Egypt and his imagination. For now, though, Cleopatra stood at his side as Alexandria braced for battle. The queen who had fled her city in silence would soon defend it in fire. And for the first time in her life, she was not alone. The marble corridors of the Alexandrian palace had seen centuries of power plays, but never anything like this. Julius Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, master of legions, the man who bent Rome itself to his will, now walked those halls beside Cleopatra, the exiled queen who had returned in a rug and rewritten her fate overnight. Together, they looked less like ruler and guest, more like a storm that had learned to smile. The city outside seethed. Pothinus Achilles and their puppet king Ptolemy III fumed in their stronghold, vowing vengeance. They called Cleopatra a traitor, Caesar a tyrant. But inside the palace, something extraordinary unfolded. Two of the most ambitious minds of the ancient world began building an alliance, not just of survival, but of vision. At first, it was practical. Caesar needed Egypt's grain and Cleopatra's legitimacy to stabilize Rome's food supply. Cleopatra needed Caesar's soldiers to reclaim her throne and crush her brother's faction. But as their plans deepened, so did their fascination with each other. Cleopatra had met powerful men before, flatterers, pretenders, weaklings, pretending to be lions. Caesar was different. He was sharp, restless, and endlessly curious, as hungry for knowledge as for conquest. He asked her about the Nile's cycles, about Egypt's gods, about the pyramids. Unlike most Romans, he didn't sneer at the mysteries of the East. And unlike most queens, Cleopatra didn't shy away from telling him when he was wrong. When they spoke, they didn't argue. They collided. In the library courtyards, she guided him through papyrus scrolls older than Rome itself, showing him star charts, surgical manuals, and treatises on philosophy. "You Romans build roads," she said, teasing, "but we built the stars." Caesar chuckled, but didn't argue. He spent hours there with her, half in wonder, half in strategy, realizing that this young woman ruled not by force, but by intellect. Their partnership was as political as it was personal. Together, they drafted decrees reinstating Cleopatra as co-ruler with her younger brother, this time the baby Ptolemy XIV, conveniently too young to wield power. The move pleased the Egyptian priests, who preferred divine balance, and the Roman officers, who preferred stability. But while the documents bore both names, the voice behind them was hers. Cleopatra's policies began to breathe life back into a battered nation. She reopened trade routes, restructured temple taxes, and reestablished the authority of the Nile cult, not as superstition, but as national identity. Caesar admired her administrative precision. "You rule like a Roman," he told her. She smiled. Then perhaps Rome should try ruling like an Egyptian. It wasn't all scrolls and strategy. War still raged at Alexandria's edges. Achilles' troops laid siege to the city, cutting off supplies. The palace was surrounded by chaos arrows clattering off columns, smoke curling through courtyards. Cleopatra's servants ran messages through hidden corridors. Caesar's legionaries defended the harbor. Amid that turmoil, the two rulers planned the reconstruction of Egypt as calmly as if they were rearranging furniture. Once, when fire from the docks threatened to reach the palace, Cleopatra joined Caesar on the ramparts, the night sky glowing red above them. "Your people fight like demons," she said. "They are Romans," he answered. "We're born to fight." "And Egyptians," she countered softly, "are born to endure." Caesar turned to her, realizing perhaps for the first time that this wasn't some desperate princess clinging to Rome's mercy. This was a sovereign. And in that shared glance, an empire shifted slightly on its axis. When the fighting finally ended, Achilles defeated Pothinus, executed Ptolemy. Drowned in the Nile, while fleeing battle, the smoke cleared to reveal a new Egypt. Caesar and Cleopatra stood side by side in the dawn light over the harbor, the sea calm again after months of blood. The people who had once cursed her name now shouted it in gratitude. Peace, fragile but luminous, returned. Alexandria resumed its music, the chatter of philosophers, the hum of markets, the scent of lotus and incense rising through marble courtyards. And amid that restoration, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. He was named Ptolemy 15, Philopator Philometor Caesar, known simply as Caesarion, Little Caesar. To some, he was a symbol of unity between East and West. To others, a provocation. Rome buzzed with rumors the mighty Caesar had fathered a foreign prince. But in Egypt, the people rejoiced. The queen who had once fled into the desert now held a child born of two empires. Caesar stayed in Egypt for several months longer than politics strictly required. He and Cleopatra sailed together up the Nile, an extravagant procession that looked more like a myth than a diplomatic tour. The riverbanks erupted in cheers as their barge, draped in gold and purple, drifted through the current. Musicians played priests, offered blessings, and farmers knelt in the fields. The Romans grumbled that Caesar had gone mad, bewitched by an Eastern queen. But in truth, it was less bewitchment than revelation. He saw in Cleopatra a ruler who didn't rely on legions to command loyalty, who could weave nations together with words, culture, and charisma. And she saw in him the force of empire, disciplined, inexorable, terrifying, yet human enough to be persuaded. At night, under the desert stars, they spoke of destiny. Caesar dreamed of reforming Rome into something grander, more eternal. Cleopatra dreamed of restoring Egypt to its ancient glory, not as a client state, but as an equal partner to any empire. Between them lay the idea of a new world, a fusion of intellect and might, East and West philosophy and discipline. Of course, the world wasn't ready for such dreams, but for a brief and glittering moment, it almost seemed possible. When Caesar finally departed for Rome, promising to secure her throne from afar, Cleopatra watched from the harbor, her infant son in her arms. The sails faded into the horizon like wings against the dawn. She whispered a blessing to the sea, half prayer, half challenge. "Bring him victory," she said softly, "and bring him back." Behind her, the palace shimmered with new life. Ahead, the waves rolled toward destiny. Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, mother of Caesar's son, stood between them, the calm eye in the storm of history. The smoke of war had finally drifted away from Alexandria. In its place, the city began to breathe again, slowly, cautiously, like a patient waking from fever. Ships returned to the harbor, laden with goods instead of soldiers. The markets reopened their stalls, heavy with grain, honey, papyrus, and spices. And above it all, the queen who had once hidden in the desert now stood resplendent on her balcony, watching her kingdom hum with life once more. Cleopatra was 21, a mother, and though she rarely said it aloud, the undisputed ruler of Egypt. The brother she shared her throne with, the child king Ptolemy XIV, was a ceremonial shadow. Rome might have pretended the arrangement was balanced, but every Egyptian knew who governed. For the first time since her father's reign, Egypt had stability. And this time, it was born not of Roman gold, but of Cleopatra's intellect. Her court became the heart of a cultural and scientific revival. She reopened the Great Library, reestablished stipends for scholars, and invited astronomers, mathematicians, and physicians from across the Mediterranean to study under Egyptian skies. She was fascinated by medicine, so much so that she personally funded research into herbal remedies and the preservation of bodies. Some whispered she mixed her own perfumes and potions, creating scents that could soften the hardest diplomat. Her interest wasn't vanity, it was branding. Cleopatra understood image better than any ruler before her. To her people, she became Isis incarnate, the mother, the goddess, the eternal protector. She commissioned new art, showing her as both human and divine, wearing Greek diadems, but Egyptian robes, her face serene, yet unmistakably alive. Statues of her, holding Caesarion, echoed through the temples of Memphis and Thebes. The message was clear: Egypt had its pharaoh again, and the gods approved. But beneath the gold leaf and ceremony, Cleopatra's policies were ruthlessly practical. She overhauled the tax system, cracking down on corruption among officials who had grown fat during years of civil war. She ensured that grain exports were balanced so that Egypt's farmers didn't starve while Rome feasted. She reorganized the navy, expanded trade routes to India and Arabia, and personally met with merchants who could bring silk and incense up the Red Sea. In court, she surrounded herself not with flatterers, but with thinkers. She encouraged debate, even dissent, a dangerous luxury in monarchies. Her ministers often left meetings dizzy, either from admiration or exhaustion. She would pivot from theology to geometry in a single breath, question agricultural reports with surgical precision, and tease her advisors with the same wit she'd once used on Caesar. She never argues, one Roman visitor complained. She just makes you realize she's right halfway through your own speech. Still ruling wasn't all scrolls and laughter. The peace was delicate, and Cleopatra knew it. Rome's gaze, though distant, never really left Egypt. Caesar's triumphs in Europe were her protection, but also her vulnerability. As long as he lived, she could govern freely. If he fell, her throne might crumble like a sandcastle before the tide. To solidify her position, she doubled down on diplomacy. She sent gifts of papyrus and gold to Roman senators, maintained correspondence with scholars in Athens, and hosted foreign envoys with such generosity that even her enemies left the palace dazzled. Cleopatra's banquets became legend tables of silver fountains of wine musicians playing harps and flutes, while philosophers argued beneath palm fronds. But there was purpose in the spectacle. Every guest left with a story, and in those stories the queen's myth grew larger than life. Rome might sneer at her luxury, but the world was listening, and Cleopatra knew that image was armor. When Caesar returned to Rome, he brought both glory and scandal. He had won new wars, reformed the calendar, and crowned himself dictator for life, but he also brought Cleopatra's name with him, whispered like perfume through the Senate halls. Some senators fumed at the thought of their hero consorting with a foreign queen. Others, curious, envied him. And when Cleopatra herself arrived in Rome a year later, the city nearly imploded. She came not as a concubine, but as a monarch with her own entourage, her own treasure, and her son by her side. Rome had never seen anything like her. Crowds gathered in the streets just to glimpse her procession silks, shimmering like water chariots, carved in gold musicians, playing the haunting rhythms of the Nile. To some Romans, she was exotic brilliance. To others, she was an omen proof that Caesar's ambition had no borders. They called her the Queen of the East, the Siren of the Nile, the foreign danger wrapped in perfume. Cleopatra ignored the gossip. She spent her days with Caesar in his villa across the Tiber, discussing governance, trade, and reform. It was there she saw the extent of Rome's rot, its corruption, its hatred of its own genius. Once, while walking through the Forum, she remarked quietly to a friend, "Rome worships its heroes until it must kneel to them. Then it kills them." She wasn't wrong. In those months, she watched Caesar the reformer turn into Caesar the target. The Senate trembled at his popularity. The whispers of conspiracy grew louder, sharper. Cleopatra urged caution, begged him to trust fewer men. He only smiled. "If I start fearing daggers," he told her, "I will never rise again." She saw what he could not, that Rome was a city built on admiration, until admiration turned to envy. When she finally returned to Egypt, she did so with a heart-divided part of her thrilled by the rebirth of her kingdom, part of her haunted by the shadow forming behind Caesar's name. In Alexandria, life resumed its radiance. Festivals filled the streets, temples glowed with candlelight, and the Nile flooded on time, a good omen. Cleopatra threw herself into her work, expanding schools, restoring temples, even commissioning translations of Greek texts into Egyptian for the first time in centuries. It was as if she wanted to prove that intellect, not empire, was what made civilizations endure. On quiet evenings, she would hold Caesarion close and look out over the harbor. Ships drifted like silver leaves on the water. The lighthouse burned steady. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that peace might last, that the gods had finally decided to be kind. But somewhere far to the northwest, under the marble arches of Rome, knives were already being sharpened. And Cleopatra, queen of renewal, would soon learn that no amount of wisdom could shield her from the madness of men who feared greatness, especially their own. The news came like a thunderclap that silences a city. In the spring of 44 BCE, a Roman messenger arrived in Alexandria, his face pale from sea travel and worse tidings. He was brought before the queen as dawn light spilled through the columns of the audience hall. Cleopatra listened in silence as he spoke the words that would redraw her world. "Julius Caesar is dead." For a moment, there was only the sound of the fountains. The marble walls seemed to hold their breath. The messenger continued, assassinated in the Senate, surrounded by men he called friends, stabbed beneath the statue of Pompey. 23 wounds for a man who thought himself immortal. Cleopatra didn't faint. She didn't cry. She only closed her eyes and pressed her fingers to her lips as though sealing away a scream. Then, after a pause that seemed to last a century, she asked the question that mattered most. Who rules Rome now? The answer, no one and everyone, was worse than death. Rome had shattered overnight. Caesar's killers, led by Brutus and Cassius, proclaimed themselves liberators. The streets of the capital ran thick with panic loyalty, shifting hour by hour. The Senate tried to restore the Republic. The army wanted revenge. In the chaos, Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted general and co-consul, seized control of Caesar's papers, treasury, and legions. The Republic trembled between anarchy and dictatorship once more. Cleopatra dismissed the court and walked alone into her garden. The air smelled of jasmine and river wind. Her hands trembled only once when she touched the amulet of Isis that hung around her neck. She had loved Caesar, not with the naive fire of a girl, but with the recognition of an equal. Together, they had imagined a future where knowledge ruled alongside power. Now that vision had been butchered on marble floors. But mourning was a luxury she could not afford. Rome's grief was always political, and she knew that whatever replaced Caesar would soon look to Egypt for grain, for gold, for leverage. She had to act before the tide of empire turned against her. The first step was security. Cleopatra immediately ordered fortifications strengthened along the Nile and garrisons resupplied. She called her generals to the palace. "Until Rome remembers who it is," she said coolly, "we will remember who we are." Egypt would not collapse just because its ally had. Next, she moved to secure her son's claim. Caesarion, barely 4 years old, was Caesar's only living child, the living bridge between the Nile and the Tiber. Cleopatra proclaimed him co-ruler of Egypt, his small figure appearing beside hers on newly minted coins. It was both maternal devotion and strategic genius. The boy became living proof that Caesar's bloodline survived outside Rome's reach. The priests celebrated, the people rejoiced. In Rome, however, the reaction was less enthusiastic. Antony, though loyal to Caesar's memory, was not eager to share power with a foreign queen and her illegitimate heir. Cleopatra understood. Men like Antony admired power only when it bowed to them. She had no intention of bowing. For a time, she waited, sending cautious envoys to Rome, gauging its mood. Reports returned like fragments from a storm. Antony consolidating his influence, Octavian, Caesar's young adopted son and heir, rising like a pale, quiet thundercloud, and Brutus and Cassius fleeing east to rally the last loyalists of the Republic. The world had split into shards, and Egypt lay at its glittering, dangerous center. Cleopatra turned inward. She poured her focus into Egypt's stability, replanting orchards, overseeing temple restorations, reforming the grain fleets. To her people, she was calm, radiant, divine. To her advisors, she was unreadable, her grief distilled into precision. "A queen cannot weep," she told one attendant softly. "The Nile does not mourn the rain." But the stillness could not last. Late that same year, Roman ships appeared on the horizon, Antony's envoys carrying orders and opportunities. Antony demanded grain ships and funds for his campaign against Caesar's assassins. It was phrased as a request, but everyone knew it was a test. Would Egypt serve Rome's new masters as obediently as it had served Caesar? Cleopatra smiled. "Tell your general," she replied, "that Egypt does not serve. Egypt partners." It was a bold answer, one only she could afford to make. Antony, ever the pragmatist, saw the wisdom in it. He needed her resources, but he also remembered her name, the woman who had held Caesar's ear, who spoke Latin like a senator and Greek like a goddess. "Let her be," he is said to have remarked. "We may yet need her." And he was right. Meanwhile, the war for Caesar's legacy raged across the Mediterranean. Brutus and Cassius were hunted and cornered at Philippi. Antony and Octavian emerged victorious, and with victory came rivalry. Rome was once again divided, this time between two men too powerful to share the world. In Egypt, Cleopatra watched from afar, her chessboard expanding with every dispatch. Antony was older, impulsive, charismatic, a soldier who preferred wine to strategy. Octavian was young, calculating, cold as marble. Each saw Egypt as both prize and peril. Cleopatra knew that whichever one she allied with could secure her dynasty or destroy it. In quiet nights on the palace roof, she stood gazing at the stars above the harbor, the same constellations she had shown Caesar years before. Somewhere beyond that horizon, men were killing each other in his name. She whispered to the wind, "You built a world that cannot live without you." Below her, the city glimmered peaceful, for now, but ringed by uncertainty. The Queen of Renewal had become the Queen of Suspense, walking a tightrope between two Roman storms. When dawn broke, she gave new orders to her scribes: prepare envoys for both Antony and Octavian. "We will listen first," she said, "then decide whom the gods favor." Her attendants nodded, though they knew what she truly meant. Whom Cleopatra favors, the gods will follow. And so began the next act, one not of rebirth, but of reckoning, when love and empire would once again entwine, and Cleopatra, widow of Caesar, would find herself staring into the eyes of another Roman, destined to change the world. It was a summer evening in 41 BCE, when the Nile shimmered like molten gold beneath a violet sky, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The Roman general, Mark Antony, had summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus, a city far to the north, neutral ground. He said, though everyone knew it was really a test. He wanted her allegiance, her ships, and her treasure. And perhaps if rumor was true, he wanted to see if the legend of Cleopatra was as captivating as Rome claimed. For her part, Cleopatra was not inclined to be tested. She had been underestimated once before, and that had ended with her sitting beside Julius Caesar in triumph. She would not make the same entrance twice. This time, she would arrive not as supplicant or partner, but as spectacle. So she prepared a show that even the gods would envy. Her barge set sail up the Cydnus River, its hull gilded and painted with purple sails that caught the sun like wings. The oars, tipped with silver, struck the water in rhythm with flutes and drums. Perfumed smoke drifted over the deck, the scent of rose and cinnamon. And there beneath a golden canopy, Cleopatra reclined, dressed as Isis, the goddess of rebirth. Attendants fanned her with peacock feathers, while children dressed as cupids scattered petals before her feet. It wasn't diplomacy. It was theater, and Antony, watching from the riverbank, was both furious and fascinated. The queen had answered his summons yes, but she had arrived as though he were the one being presented. When her barge reached the docks, the crowd of Tarsus citizens gasped and knelt. Antony's soldiers, veterans of countless campaigns, stood spellbound. The queen's attendants unfurled a ramp draped in silk, and Cleopatra stepped ashore with the grace of a deity who had never learned to doubt herself. She bowed slightly, not to Antony, but to the air, as if acknowledging that the stage was properly set. Antony approached, armored, sunburned, still smelling of campfire and battle dust. For a heartbeat, the two simply regarded each other, the soldier, who could command armies, and the queen, who could command belief. Then Cleopatra smiled the same serene, knowing smile that had once melted Caesar's pragmatism into poetry. "General," she said in perfect Latin, her voice smooth as wine, "I thought you summoned a queen, not a debtor." Antony blinked. "You owe tribute to Rome," he said, recovering. "Or have you forgotten?" She tilted her head. "I owe tribute to my allies, not my interrogators. Tell me, which are you?" It was audacious. It was dangerous. And Antony loved it. That evening, she invited him aboard her barge for a banquet, a calculated reversal of power. When Antony arrived expecting formality, he found music, laughter, and tables groaning with food. Golden lamps reflected off the water, throwing ripples of light across his armor. Every dish, every scent, every note of flute was designed to disarm him. Cleopatra did not flatter. She entertained. She spoke of philosophy, of politics, of the absurdity of men who thought conquest made them immortal. Antony, who had faced death 100 times without blinking, found himself speechless. He'd known many women, many queens, but never one who seemed to see him, who treated him not as conqueror or prize, but as a character in her story. When she teased him about Rome's endless wars, he laughed harder than he had in years. When she offered him wine spiced with honey, he forgot to guard his heart. By the night's end, Antony's curiosity had turned into obsession. The next morning, he sent word that Cleopatra would not be charged tribute. Instead, he would accompany her back to Egypt as her guest. His officers were horrified. "She's bewitched you unwarned." Antony grinned, then let the spell last. Their journey down the Nile was the stuff of legend. Cleopatra turned the voyage into a festival, floating palaces, music, and endless feasts under the stars. Fishermen abandoned their nets just to watch. In the villages, people lined the riverbanks chanting her name as if Isis herself were passing. Antony, lounging beside her on deck, marveled at the devotion she inspired. "They love you as if you were divine," he said. "They believe what I believe," she replied, "that Egypt's soul is eternal and perhaps a little contagious." By the time they reached Alexandria, the alliance was sealed, not merely political, but personal. Antony was entranced by her wit and grandeur. Cleopatra was intrigued by his loyalty and fire. He was bold, unrefined, utterly Roman, the kind of man who would fight lions for sport, yet who listened when she spoke of philosophy. Together, they seemed to embody both halves of empire, the sword and the scroll. In the months that followed, their bond deepened. Alexandria became their playground, a city reborn in laughter, indulgence, and strange experiments. Cleopatra hosted nightly banquets themed around gods and myths. Antony competed in games, drank with scholars, and occasionally tried and failed to beat Egyptian priests at riddles. Rome whispered that he'd gone mad, an emperor turned Egyptian. But Cleopatra saw it differently. For the first time since Caesar's death, she allowed herself to live not as strategist, but as woman and queen united. The loneliness that had shadowed her since childhood began to lift. She laughed more, slept less, dreamed again. Still, she was never foolish enough to forget what held them together: necessity. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to fund his eastern campaigns. Cleopatra needed Rome's muscle to keep her throne secure. But in between those pragmatic calculations, something rare bloomed: affection, admiration, perhaps even love. One evening, as the city's lights shimmered across the water, Antony asked, "Do you trust me?" She looked at him, really looked, and said, "I trust what we could be. The rest, the gods will decide." For now, the gods seemed merciful. The wars of men paused. The Nile rose, the harvest flourished, and Alexandria glowed like a city out of myth. But somewhere beyond the horizon, another storm was gathering, a quieter, colder one. Octavian Caesar's adopted heir watched from Rome, sharpening not swords, but stories. And when Antony and Cleopatra's golden revels reached his ears, he smiled the kind of smile that foretold ruin. For now, though, the queen and the general danced on the edge of eternity, too radiant to see the shadow rising behind them. For a brief and glittering moment, it seemed as though the gods themselves had stepped aside to watch them. Antony and Cleopatra, Rome's warrior and Egypt's goddess, moved through their days as if they were creating a new mythology in real time. Alexandria became their stage feasts that lasted until dawn, philosophers quoting Aristotle beside drunk soldiers, priests of Isis laughing alongside legionaries. The city that had once been fractured by war now pulsed with color and song. They called themselves the Inimitable Livers, a private society of pleasure and wit. By day, Cleopatra governed with meticulous precision, balancing accounts, signing decrees, and inspecting shipyards. By night, she became the embodiment of Egypt's splendor, the queen in gold, the hostess of eternity. Antony, who had once commanded entire continents, now competed in drunken fishing contests with her on the Nile, though it was said she secretly had divers swim below and attach pre-caught fish to his hook so that he might win. He would laugh when he discovered the trick, accusing her of cheating. Not cheating, she'd reply. Governing. Their humor was famous, their extravagance infamous. Yet beneath the laughter lay calculation. Cleopatra knew that Rome's gaze was fixed on them, that every rumor of excess was both shield and sword. The Romans might mock them as decadent fools, but decadence could be a kind of diplomacy. Let them laugh, she thought. So long as they fear us, they cannot dismiss us. Still, Antony's heart was split between two worlds. His ambitions in the east burned as fiercely as his love for the queen. With Cleopatra's gold and Egypt's ships, he launched campaigns into Syria, Judea, and Parthia, dreaming of empire beyond empire, an eastern dominion to rival even Rome's. In his victories, Cleopatra saw a mirror of her own ambition, two rulers building a world that did not answer to the Senate's decrees or the Republic's ghosts. When Antony returned from campaign, weary and dust-covered, Cleopatra met him not with incense and adoration, but with maps. They would spread them across marble tables, tracing borders with their fingertips, plotting cities not yet built. Together, they imagined a vast realm stretching from the Euphrates to the Nile, from the deserts of Arabia to the green coast of Greece, a new empire of intellect and abundance. The Eastern Dream, they called it. It was audacious. It was impossible. And it was intoxicating. For Egypt, these years were golden. Trade flourished. Temples gleamed with restoration. Scholars returned to the library, and festivals filled the streets. Cleopatra's presence seemed to bless the land itself, every flood of the Nile perfectly timed, every harvest abundant. Statues rose of her, and Antony depicted as Isis and Dionysus, the divine pair, bringing fertility and joy. The symbolism wasn't subtle, but neither were they. Antony, who had spent his youth among soldiers, found something in Egypt that Rome had never offered him grace. In Rome, we rule by fear, he told her one evening, as they watched the city lights shimmer on the harbor. Here, you rule by awe. She smiled faintly. Awe lasts longer. And yet she was no mere dreamer. Cleopatra understood politics better than any senator. When Antony's Roman wife, Octavia's sister, to Octavian, wrote him letters pleading for reconciliation, Cleopatra read them with calm amusement. She knew Rome was watching, judging, waiting for a misstep. She sends you virtue, Cleopatra said dryly. Send her silence in return. Antony hesitated, torn between his Roman obligations and the magnetic pull of Alexandria. He stayed. The consequences were inevitable. In Rome, Octavian began whispering that Antony had fallen under a foreign woman's spell, that he was being emasculated by the East. The propaganda grew like wildfire. Coins were minted showing Cleopatra's face beside Antony's, an outrage to Roman purists. The Senate muttered that he was no longer Roman, that Egypt had made him soft. Cleopatra, aware of every rumor, chose not to deny them. She leaned into the legend. If they would paint her as a goddess of luxury, she would become one. If they accused her of enchanting Antony, she would make enchantment her weapon. And so her processions became grander, her banquets more dazzling, her public appearances radiant with divine imagery. She was no longer merely queen. She was Egypt itself, timeless, luminous, unconquerable. But she was also human. And when Antony left again for another campaign, this time against Parthia, She watched his ship vanish into the horizon with a strange ache she couldn't name. It wasn't the loneliness she feared. It was the pattern. She knew history too well. Men who loved her land always returned, changed, or not at all. The reports came slowly, then badly. The campaign faltered. The Parthians were ruthless, the desert unforgiving. When Antony limped back months later, his legions decimated Cleopatra, went to meet him in Syria, bringing supplies and comfort instead of reproach. She greeted him in person, dressed simply, without crown or ceremony. For once she played no goddess, only woman. He fell to his knees before her and whispered, "You came." She touched his cheek, dusty and unshaven. "You called." That winter they stayed in Alexandria, both bruised but unbroken. Cleopatra nursed his wounds, mended his pride, and reminded him that even gods must sometimes rest. The people celebrated their reunion as divine fate. Poets sang that Isis had restored Osiris from death again, and for a while they believed it. But outside Egypt's radiant borders, Octavian's web tightened. He fed Rome a steady diet of scandal tales of Antony giving away Roman provinces to Cleopatra, of Caesarion proclaimed as King of Kings of Egypt's queen, sitting upon Rome's destiny. Each rumor had a grain of truth. All were sharpened into weapons. In the candlelight of her study, Cleopatra read intercepted Roman letters and saw what Antony could not. "They are not afraid of you," she told him one night. "They are afraid of me. To destroy you, they must destroy my image first." Antony frowned. "Then we will give them something to fear." It was the wrong answer, but perhaps the only one they knew how to give. Together, they made plans for the greatest festival Egypt had ever seen, a coronation of empire, a declaration to the world that the East could rival the West in splendor, intellect, and power. Antony would proclaim his children kings of future realms. Cleopatra would sit beside him as Isis reborn. The stage was set, the torches were lit, and as the drums echoed across the Nile, no one, not even the gods, could tell whether this was triumph or prelude to catastrophe. The dawn that rose over Alexandria that year looked like a painting of perfection. The sea glowed turquoise beneath the marble quays. The Pharaoh's lighthouse shimmered through sea mist like a star tethered to earth, and the city pulsed with life. To the east, markets buzzed with merchants from Arabia and India, their ships heavy with silk ivory and cinnamon. To the west, temples glistened in gold leaf, newly restored at Cleopatra's command. It was in every sense the golden age of her reign. Egypt stood rich, peaceful, and radiant, a kingdom that seemed to defy gravity, suspended between old gods and new empires. Cleopatra ruled from her palace above the harbor, a woman in her 30s who had outwitted kings, conquered generals, and bent the world's most powerful men into uneasy orbit. Her court was no longer merely a royal household. It was a university, an observatory, a cabinet, a theater. The queen held daily councils, not just with ministers and admirals, but with philosophers, healers, mathematicians, poets, and her personal passion, astronomers. At night, she would summon scholars to the palace rooftop to chart the movement of stars reflected in the black glass of the Mediterranean. "See," she'd murmur, tracing constellations with her ring. "The sky repeats itself, but men call it fate." Those who met her said Cleopatra was as terrifying as she was magnetic. She had the gift of making everyone's servant or senator feel as if they alone held her full attention. Her voice could shift like a chameleon, soft as honey, with poets sharp as glass, with diplomats calm as the Nile with soldiers. She laughed easily, but never idly. She knew when to flatter and when to correct. Once a Roman envoy tried to lecture her on taxation. She listened patiently, then asked, Do your Roman farmers cultivate grain underwater? He stammered. No, Majesty. Then perhaps she said sweetly, you'll allow me to know more of the Nile than the Tiber. Under her rule, Alexandria became the envy of the world. The great library was rebuilt and expanded scrolls copied from across 3 continents. The Mousillon, its sister academy, buzzed with experimenters dissecting fish, measuring eclipses, or debating Aristotle over honeyed wine. Artists from Greece, engineers from Syria, traders from Nubia, all flocked to her city. The queen herself patronized these scholars generously, but demanded results. Knowledge, she said, is a god that rewards only the devoted. Her own writings on medicine, philosophy, and cosmetics were said to fill several scrolls, now lost to time. Even her vanity was intellectual. She tested perfumes as a chemist would, altering proportions of myrrh and cedar oil to capture not beauty, but memory. Politically, Cleopatra's grasp was firmer than ever. She controlled Egypt's vast economy with the efficiency of an accountant and the imagination of an artist. Trade with Arabia brought incense. Caravans from Sudan brought gold. Grain shipments to Greece and Italy fed half the Mediterranean. When famine struck Syria, she sent Egyptian wheat not as charity, but as diplomacy. Every sack of grain bought her another ally. Her wealth was staggering. Temples poured tribute into her treasuries, and the royal mint gleamed day and night. Yet Cleopatra was not extravagant for vanity's sake, at least not only. Her grandeur was deliberate, theatrical, political. She understood that in an age ruled by men, a woman must either appear divine or be devoured. And so she gave the world a goddess. Each public appearance was choreographed to perfection. When she traveled the streets of Alexandria, her chariot moved slowly through clouds of incense. Priests sang hymns to Isis, while the people knelt, throwing lotus blossoms beneath her wheels. Look upon her, one Greek poet wrote, and you will understand why mortals built pyramids. But beyond all this splendor, a shadow lengthened across the sea. Octavian, the quiet, watchful heir of Caesar, now ruler of Rome's western provinces. While Antony governed the east and played Pharaoh beside Cleopatra, Octavian stayed in Italy, speaking little and listening to everyone. His genius was not charisma, but patience. And patience, Cleopatra knew, could kill faster than any sword. Still, she refused to show fear. She and Antony moved forward with their grand project, the coronation at Alexandria, a ceremony so opulent it would echo through centuries. In the great gymnasium, beneath banners of blue and gold, the royal pair appeared before tens of thousands. Antony dressed as Dionysus, the god of wine and victory. Cleopatra radiant as Isis, the mother of kings. On that day, they crowned their children rulers of future realms: Egypt, Cyprus, Armenia, Libya, a symbolic empire stretching beyond maps. And in the center, on a raised golden throne, stood Caesarion, the child of Caesar, and Cleopatra declared king of kings. The crowd roared, priests chanted, doves were released into the sky. It was theater, yes, but also declaration. A new dynasty had been born, one that dared to imagine a Mediterranean not ruled by Rome alone. Back in Italy, Octavian seethed. The propaganda practically wrote itself. Antony has given away Roman lands to an Egyptian temptress. He kneels before her foreign gods. He calls her son, an illegitimate child, the heir of Caesar. The words spread like wildfire, and Rome, so easily frightened by brilliance it did not understand, began to turn. Senators who once toasted Antony now whispered that he had lost his Roman virtue, that he had traded the laurel for the lotus, that Cleopatra's perfume had poisoned the republic. In Alexandria, she heard the rumors and smiled thinly. When men cannot defeat a woman, she told her scribes they accuse her of magic, but even her laughter could not drown the drumbeat of fate. Egypt's wealth was growing, its learning flourishing. but its peace rested on the fault line between two titans, Antony and Octavian, whose friendship was crumbling by the day. Sometimes on quiet evenings, after the festivals ended, Cleopatra would walk alone through her gardens. The fountain's murmured torches flickered, the scent of jasmine hung thick in the air. She would look toward the sea, knowing that beyond it, Rome was gathering its storm. She was no longer the girl who had once fled into the desert. She was the architect of nations, the mother of kings. Yet she also knew that empires like tides always return to the sea, and Rome's tide was rising again. Still, she whispered to herself what she had believed since childhood. The Nile always returns. The gods always balance their scales. And for a while longer, under the amber glow of Alexandria's lamps, it truly seemed she might be right. Golden Alexandria glittered on the edge of a knife. Beneath the music and perfume, everyone could feel it, the air growing heavier, the laughter a little too loud, as if the city itself were pretending not to hear the thunder from Rome. By 33 BCE, the alliance between Antony and Octavian had cracked like a dry riverbed. Once brothers in arms, they now spoke only through propaganda. Each accused the other of treachery, corruption, ambition. But Octavian had something Antony never mastered: patience, and a sense for how stories shape empires. In Rome, he began a quiet campaign, not of soldiers, but of rumors. His message was simple. Venomous, effective, Antony no longer belonged to Rome. He belonged to Cleopatra. Pamphlets circulated through the forum describing her as a serpent queen, a sorceress who had bewitched the noble general. They said she whispered spells into his ear, that she drained his coffers with her luxuries, that she had turned him into her puppet. The Senate chuckled, then frowned, then began to believe it. A Roman consul. One orator sneered, wearing Egyptian linen and calling himself Dionysus. What will he call himself? Next husband of Isis? It was a brilliant strategy. The battle for hearts always begins with laughter. Cleopatra understood the danger at once. She had seen this kind of fear before, how powerful men explained their own failures by blaming women who refused to obey. But now the stakes were higher. This wasn't gossip. It was war being written into rumor. Antony, meanwhile, was too proud to see it. He dismissed Octavian as a child. He sends words, he scoffed, while I have legions. Cleopatra smiled tightly. Words outlive legions, she murmured. And so she prepared, quietly, efficiently, like a general sharpening invisible weapons. Shipwrights in the royal dockyards began constructing new war galleys. Blacksmiths worked day and night forging armor. The Nile's tributaries swelled with movement. Sailors training horses transported food stockpiled. Egypt was waking its war machine, ancient, methodical, and dazzlingly modern. But even as she planned, Cleopatra played her part in the theater of peace. She continued hosting feasts for Roman envoys, sending gifts to friendly senators, and funding temples across the eastern provinces. When asked by foreign visitors if she feared war, she would smile. Egypt fears only drought, she'd say, and men who mistake patience for surrender. Still, her calm couldn't mask what everyone knew. The lover's empire, half Roman, half Egyptian, was splitting at the seams. Antony's victories in Armenia and his declarations of new kingships for their children had enraged Octavian beyond reason. The final insult came when Antony formally divorced Octavian's sister Octavia, a political marriage long abandoned but still useful as Roman symbolism. The Senate gasped. Octavian smiled. He has chosen Egypt over Rome, he announced. Then we shall show him what Rome does to traitors and their foreign queen. War was no longer rumor. It was inevitable. Cleopatra faced it with the same composure she had worn since exile. In her private chambers, she studied maps of the Mediterranean lit by candlelight. They will come by sea, she said, tracing her finger along the coastline. so we will meet them there." Antony looked tired, his confidence wearing thin. "The fleet is ready. You and I together, no one can stand against us." She met his gaze for a long moment. "Rome does not fight to win," she said softly. "It fights to erase." But she fought anyway. It was never in her nature to wait for fate. Under her direction, Alexandria became a city transformed for war. The shipyards thundered like drums. The queen herself inspected the vessels barefoot on the planks, sunlight glinting on her gold diadem. She spoke to the captains, reminded them of their ancestors who had ruled when Rome was still mud huts by a river. Her confidence was contagious. To the Egyptian sailors, she wasn't just a monarch, she was prophecy incarnate. Still, there were nights when even Cleopatra allowed herself to feel the dread creeping in. On those nights, she would walk alone along the palace terraces, looking out at the endless Black Sea. Somewhere out there, Octavian's legions were assembling his ships, multiplying like shadows on the horizon. She would stand for hours, the warm wind tangling her hair, and whisper to the silence, "They think they are coming for me, but they are coming for history." In the city below, whispers spread like the wind that the queen was making offerings to Isis for victory, that she slept little and ate less, that she carried scrolls of battle plans wherever she went. Even the children of Alexandria played at being Cleopatra's sailors, carving toy ships and shouting for the Nile as they launched them into fountains. Antony tried to match her energy, but the weight of Rome's hatred pressed on him. The soldiers adored him, but he was no longer the general of legend. The old confidence that had once carried him through Gaul and Parthia now flickered under self-doubt and too much wine. Cleopatra never mocked him for it. She simply steadied him, as she always had. Together, they made their final preparations. Cleopatra financed the entire campaign, outfitting 200 warships, supplying provisions for tens of thousands of men. Her treasury poured into the war effort like a second Nile. She knew the risk. If they lost, Egypt would be stripped bare. But surrender for her was worse than ruin. In those last calm weeks before the storm, Alexandria took on an eerie beauty. The harbor gleamed with ships. The temples burned incense night and day. The people prayed to the gods of land and river for protection. And at the palace, the queen and her lover stood side by side on the balcony overlooking the sea, the air heavy with salt and omens. "Whatever happens," Antony said quietly, "history will remember us." Cleopatra looked toward the horizon, where the faint outline of Roman sails could almost be imagined. "History remembers men," she said, "but it listens to women." Below them, the waves whispered against the docks, steady and eternal. The Mediterranean was waiting, as if holding its breath, for the battle that would decide who owned the world and whose name would still be spoken when marble turned to dust. Summer 31, BCE. The heat lay heavy on the sea, and the horizon shimmered like glass. Every morning, from her balcony above the harbor, Cleopatra watched her fleet, awakened masts rising like forests, sails snapping in the wind, bronze prows flashing sunlight into the water. The air smelled of tar sweat and seaweed. To most eyes, it looked like confidence. To Cleopatra, it was necessity made visible. The enemy was no longer abstract. Octavian's armada had crossed from Italy into Greece, and his general Agrippa, a quiet genius of logistics, was cutting off supply lines, choking their allies one port at a time. War was no longer coming. It was here. Cleopatra moved through her palace with a focus that frightened even her most loyal attendants. Every decision passed through her hands. Grain rations for soldiers, the repair of oars, the fortification of coastal towns. Her council met at dawn, and again at dusk, their tables covered with charts drawn on papyrus wind patterns, currents, moon cycles. She listened more than she spoke. "We will win," she told her admirals, "not by strength, but by rhythm. The sea has its own heartbeat. Listen to it. Antony listened, but restlessly. He was still Rome's greatest commander, but now his army was divided between pride and despair. His officers distrusted the Egyptian crews, calling them ornamental sailors, and Cleopatra's captains resented being lectured by Romans who had never seen a Nile flood. Cleopatra spent hours mediating quarrels that would have been beneath her once. She needed unity even if she had to sculpt it out of vanity and bribes. In truth, the Egyptian fleet was formidable, 200 great ships, massive and magnificent. Some were floating fortresses, triple-decked and armored in bronze. Cleopatra had built them herself, insisting that their design combine Egyptian craftsmanship with Greek maneuverability. They were slower than Octavian's lighter vessels, but more imposing ships meant to intimidate. Antony, meanwhile, trained his legions on land near Actium's Bay in western Greece. The camp was a maze of tents and standards smelling of leather and olive smoke. Cleopatra joined him there, setting up her own pavilion, beside his, a golden canopy embroidered with stars. Roman officers gossiped that she lived like a goddess amid soldiers. Egyptian officers called her the goddess who allowed them to live. Both were partly right. Even in war camp, Cleopatra's presence changed the air. The soldiers adored her generosity. She distributed gold from her treasury, wine from her stores, and even attended wounded men in the infirmaries, pouring water herself. She did not posture. She simply appeared where she was least expected and said the things that made men stand straighter. "You fight for more than kings," she told them. "You fight for a people who remember." Still, the alliance frayed. Supplies dwindled. Disease crept through the camp. Roman veterans muttered that fortune had left Antony for good. Each night messengers reported another defection to Octavian. And somewhere beyond the haze, Agrippa's fleet tightened its invisible net. Cleopatra watched it all with eyes that missed nothing. She sent spies disguised as traitors into Octavian's lines, bribed Greek islanders to delay his shipments, even attempted secret diplomacy with neutral rulers. "If Rome must have Egypt," she said, "let it cost them more than marble can pay." The tension between her and Antony deepened. He was torn. The soldier inside him wanted to face Octavian on land, where his veterans could crush their enemies in a single day. Cleopatra argued that the land favored Octavian's numbers. The sea, however, offered the element of surprise. "The Nile taught me," she told him quietly, "that those who control the current control the fate of the shore." He smiled wearily. "You speak like a general." "I am a queen," she replied. "It's the same profession." But privately, she knew the odds were turning against them. Octavian's propaganda had already won half the war before a sword was drawn. He spread word that Antony was enslaved by an Eastern seductress, that Cleopatra planned to move Rome's capital to Alexandria, that Caesarion was being groomed as the true son of Caesar. These were not accusations, they were psychological weapons, and they worked. In the dusty evenings before battle, Cleopatra would stand by the shore, watching the sun sink into the Ionian Sea. The water turned crimson, as though foretelling what was to come. She would trace her finger along the maps and murmur, "Wind. From the west, we move at dawn." Then she'd pause, almost smiling. But the gods love drama. They'll wait for a storm. Antony spent those nights pacing, drinking, trying to quiet the dread he would not name. His soldiers still loved him, but they whispered that Octavian fought for Rome, while Antony fought for love. Cleopatra knew that was unfair. Love was part of it. Yes, but love and power are twins in disguise. What she and Antony shared wasn't indulgence. It was belief in themselves, in destiny, in the idea that the world could belong to those bold enough to seize it. The eve of battle arrived. The air was heavy, the sea glass smooth. Torches lined the harbor like a chain of stars. Cleopatra walked through the camps one last time, her linen robes whispering in the wind, her crown catching firelight. The soldiers bowed as she passed. She did not speak of fear, only of fate. If Rome remembers anything she said, let it remember we did not kneel. She returned to her flagship, a magnificent vessel plated in gold, its prow shaped like a falcon. Inside, she wrote a final letter to the temple priests at Philae, an offering to Isis should she return victorious, and a prayer for her children if she did not. Out on the sea, the Roman fleet's watchfires flickered like constellations. Between them stretched miles of dark water, silent and waiting. Cleopatra stood on deck, her hair caught by the wind, the scent of salt and oil thick around her. She could feel the pulse of the sea beneath her feet, steady, ancient, indifferent. For a moment, she thought of her father, of Caesar, of the nights when she'd studied the stars from her palace roof. How strange, she thought, that all her life had led here to a single horizon drawn between two worlds that could never share the same sun. Then softly, almost as if to the gods themselves, she whispered, "Let history be the judge. Let the Nile remember me kindly." And as dawn began to kindle over Actium's bay, Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, took her place on the deck beside Antony, calm, defiant, and unblinking before the storm. The morning of the Battle of Actium began with deceptive stillness. The Ionian Sea lay flat as glass, reflecting a sky so clear it felt cruel. Antony's ships, magnificent and heavy with bronze, waited in the bay like beasts leashed too long. On Cleopatra's flagship, the falcon-proud Antonia sails furled. The queen stood beside her admiral, watching gulls drift lazily over the water. "They look calm," she murmured. So did the Nile, the year it swallowed 3 villages. Then came the horns. From the horizon, Octavian's fleet advanced smaller, faster, more agile. Their sails gleamed white in the sun, each one a blade of light cutting toward them. Cleopatra could almost see Agrippa's strategy unfolding from a farce around harassed choke. Antony's ships began to move oars, dipping in rhythm, their wooden creaks drowned beneath the beat of war drums. Trumpets blared. The wind shifted, and suddenly calm gave way to chaos. The first collision sounded like the cracking of mountains. Roman rams slammed into Egyptian hulls, bronze shearing wood water exploding upward. The sea, moments ago so serene, became a black mirror, shattered by fire and screams. Antony's flagship surged ahead, his orders roaring over the din. "Hold the line. Close ranks. Let them come to us." Cleopatra's fleet positioned behind his maintained formation with astonishing discipline. The queen herself stood at the prow, her linen cloak snapping in the wind, refusing to retreat. She had been called a sorceress, a temptress, a parasite on Rome, but now she looked only like what she truly was, a commander. Her voice, calm and measured, cut through the confusion. "Signal the left flank. Pull in the outer ships, they'll try to flank us there. And tell the rowers, steady. The sea rewards patience." The signalers obeyed, flags flashing in the sun. For a moment it worked. Cleopatra's ships tightened formation, their catapults launching flaming bolts that arced through the sky and exploded against Roman decks. The smell of burning pitch filled the air. Men shouted in Latin, Greek, Egyptian, 1,000 tongues, one chaos. But Agrippa's genius was patience. He avoided Antony's larger ships, circling, slicing off stragglers, cutting the wings from their formation. His lighter vessels darted in and out, setting traps, burning fuel lines, turning the sea itself into a weapon. By noon, the wind had turned against them. Cleopatra watched the flags snap in the wrong direction, smoke thickening, her eyes watering. From her deck, she could see Antony's galley locked in brutal combat, the two fleets tangled like beasts devouring each other. She gripped the railing so tightly, her rings cut into her skin. The gods have chosen their entertainment well, she said bitterly. Her admiral glanced at her, waiting for orders she wasn't ready to give. Antony's ships fought valiantly, but their size was their undoing. The sea near the coast was too narrow for maneuver. Egyptian galleys, magnificent but unwieldy, struggled to turn. Oars splintered, masts snapped. Cleopatra's war chest, her treasury, her nation burned around her ship by ship. And then amid the smoke and thunder, a gap opened in the Roman lines. No one knows precisely what happened in that instant. Some say it was a signal from the gods, others a miscommunication. But Cleopatra saw at a corridor of wind and water a chance to break free. She turned to her captain. Now, take us through. Her flagship leapt forward, sails unfurling, catching the sudden gust. The wind howled like laughter. Behind her, the royal squadron followed 20 ships strong, surging through the opening. Roman soldiers shouted in confusion. To those watching from afar, it looked like flight. To Cleopatra, it was survival, and perhaps a last desperate hope to regroup and save Antony's remaining fleet. But perception, as always, was her enemy. From his deck, Antony saw the golden sails of her ship cutting through the smoke away from the battle. The sight struck him like a blade. He thought she was retreating, abandoning him. Panic rippled through his men. "The queen flees," someone shouted. "Egypt flees." Antony hesitated one heartbeat too long. Then he made the decision that sealed their fate. He ordered his ship to follow. The soldiers on his deck screamed in disbelief. "General, no. The battle's not lost." But Antony's mind had already left the war behind. His heart, his doom was sailing toward Cleopatra's banner. He broke formation, and with that, the line collapsed. Agrippa's smaller ships, sensing weakness, surged forward like wolves scenting blood. They rammed, burned, and boarded. One by one, Antony's mighty vessels surrendered or sank. Smoke blotted out the sun. The sea turned the color of iron. Cleopatra's flagship far ahead now cut through the open water like a streak of gold fleeing a storm. The queen stood rigid, every muscle taut, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "He'll come," she whispered. "He has to." And he did. By dusk, Antony's galley caught up, battered, scorched, but still afloat. When he came aboard her ship, he was silent, his armor black with soot, his face unreadable. For a long time, neither spoke. Only the sound of waves lapping against the hull filled the air. At last, Cleopatra said softly, "We live. That is still something." He looked at her, the woman who had once made him feel immortal, and whispered, "We have lived too well." Then he turned away, watching the glow of burning ships on the horizon. The war, their dream, their empire, their myth, was sinking beneath the waves. They sailed south into the dark, the wind carrying the scent of ash and loss. Behind them, the Sea of Actium burned through the night, a funeral pyre large enough to light the fall of an age. They returned to Alexandria in silence. No trumpets, no festivals, no crowds throwing lotus petals, only the creak of burned ships and the dull murmur of oars. The city that had once greeted them as gods now watched in wary quiet as the battered fleet limped into harbor. The golden sails that had dazzled the world now looked like funeral shrouds. Cleopatra disembarked first. She did not speak, did not weep. Her attendants hovered, afraid to meet her eyes. The queen, who had once commanded the sea, now walked through her marble halls, barefoot, trailing the scent of smoke. On the horizon, the lighthouse still shone steady, indifferent, as though mocking her fall. Antony followed days later, his pride shattered, but his loyalty stubbornly intact. He refused to eat, refused to rest. The soldiers who remained loyal to him tried to cheer him, but their voices were brittle. "Rome calls me traitor," he muttered. "Perhaps they are right." Cleopatra stood behind him and said, "No. Rome calls every independent soul a traitor. It is how they justify conquest." He smiled faintly, though the smile didn't reach his eyes. "You always have a defense prepared. And you," she answered, "always have an apology." The humor fell flat. Outside the palace, the city whispered. Traders fled with their fortunes. Priests murmured uneasy prayers, and statues of Isis and Dionysus, once symbols of divine love, gathered dust. Cleopatra tightened her rule. She dismissed weak ministers, reorganized the treasury, ordered new defenses along the harbor walls. She had no illusions now Octavian would come. Rome always came. Still, she refused to surrender. If Egypt must end, she told her council, it will end on its feet. In the following months, she became a specter of discipline. At dawn, she inspected fortifications. By day, she met with diplomats, offering gold for neutrality alliances, anything to delay Octavian's march. By night, she planned escape routes for her children, Caesarion, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra, Selene, and little Ptolemy Philadelphus. The bloodline must outlive the crown, she said. A dynasty is not a tomb, it is a seed. Antony drifted between despair and defiance. He trained what remained of his legions, drilling them under the merciless Egyptian sun. But his energy was gone. He had lost more than a battle, he had lost his purpose. Some nights, he paced the palace gardens, armor half-fastened sword, dragging through the gravel. Cleopatra watched from the balcony, her heart divided between pity and frustration. Once she confronted him. "You are still Antony," she said sharply. "Rome's lion, Caesar's rival, my equal." He looked up at her eyes, red with exhaustion. "I was all those things," he said, "when I believed the world was mine to win. Now I see it never belonged to anyone." She wanted to argue, but couldn't. For the first time, she saw how human he had become, and how dangerous that humanity was in a world ruled by iron and rumor. News arrived like knives. Octavian's fleet had landed in Syria, then in Palestine, then in Cyrenaica. One by one, Egypt's allies surrendered. By summer, Octavian's banners had reached the Nile Delta. His letters to Cleopatra were sharp as daggers wrapped in silk. "Submit, and I will spare your life. Resist, and Egypt will cease to exist." She read them aloud, her voice steady. "He offers mercy, like a banker offers loans." Then she burned them. But in private, she began to weigh options too dreadful to speak. Could she truly defeat Rome, or even delay it? Egypt's armies were strong, but exhausted. Antony's Roman veterans were loyal, but outnumbered. Every courier brought worse news. Octavian advancing by land, his generals closing from the sea. She met Antony in the Hall of Columns, the same place where they had once celebrated their coronation as Isis and Dionysus. The torches flickered between them, shadows of former glory stretching across the floor. "We cannot win," she said simply, "but we can choose how we lose." Antony frowned. "You speak like a philosopher, not a queen." "Philosophers die with clean consciences," she said. "Queens rarely get that luxury." He studied her face, the calm, the calculation, the heartbreak buried beneath both. "You mean to die?" he said quietly. "I mean to rule the manner of my ending," she replied. "Even Rome cannot take that from me." In those last weeks, Cleopatra's poise took on an almost divine stillness. She organized her treasury, moving gold and jewels into secret vaults. She sent her eldest son Caesarion south toward Nubia under heavy guard. "Go as far as the river takes you," she told him. "Remember who you are and who they fear you to be." When Antony learned of it, he nodded. "You've always planned better than I've fought." They made their final preparations together, not as lovers, not even as rulers, but as co-authors of a vanishing dream. Each day brought Octavian closer. Each night brought fewer stars over Alexandria. And then one morning, the horns echoed through the city again, just as they had at Actium. From the watchtowers, the cry went up, "Rome is here." Octavian's legions had reached the gates. The last army of Egypt gathered on the sands outside the city, proud, outnumbered, and unwilling to kneel. Antony donned his armor one last time, gleaming in the dawn light, though the man inside it looked like a shadow of his legend. Cleopatra watched him from the palace steps, her expression unreadable. "Go," she said. "Show them that Rome can still fear a Roman." He smiled faintly, bowing his head. "And you show them that Egypt never dies." As the dust rose from the marching legions, Cleopatra turned and walked back into her palace. She did not look behind her. She had seen enough of war to know how every battle ends in smoke and silence in memory. By dusk, Antony's soldiers were broken. His last stand ended with betrayal, confusion, and Roman precision. When news reached the palace that he had fallen on his own sword, Cleopatra closed her eyes and whispered only one word, his name. Then she straightened her crown, called for her attendants, and began arranging her final audience, not with her people, not with her gods, but with Octavian himself. The Queen of the Nile was ready to meet the man who thought he could own history. The palace was quiet, too quiet for a place that had once throbbed with music, laughter, and the scent of sandalwood. The marble halls, still warm from the day's sun, echoed faintly with the footsteps of messengers who no longer carried orders but rumors. Rome was inside the gates. Egypt had fallen. Cleopatra sat by the window of her private chamber, gazing toward the harbor where Antony's flagship had burned. The smoke had thinned by now, only a faint smudge on the horizon. She whispered something, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a curse, and pressed her hand to the glass. Her attendants stood at a distance, afraid to disturb her. One of them, the physician Olympos, finally spoke. "Majesty, Octavian sends word. He wishes to meet." Cleopatra turned slowly. "Of course he does. Conquerors always wish to look their trophies in the eye." She rose, composed, deliberate. Her face was drawn, but her posture flawless. She bathed, perfumed herself lightly with lotus oil, and dressed not in mourning, but in majesty gold linen robes, jeweled collar, the diadem of Isis upon her brow. If Rome was to see her broken, it would at least see her radiant in ruin. Octavian arrived not long after, escorted through corridors lined with guards who had once knelt for Antony. He was young, expressionless, a creature of calculation rather than charisma. If Caesar had been thunder, Octavian was ice. When he entered the chamber, he paused just a heartbeat, as if startled by the calm in her eyes. "Queen Cleopatra," he said, his voice as smooth as marble. "Rome offers mercy to those who yield with grace." She smiled faintly. "I have met your kind of mercy before. It wears laurel wreaths and leaves blood on the floor." He ignored the remark. "Your country will be spared. You will live if you accompany me to Rome. My people must see that Egypt has submitted." It was all she needed to hear, to be paraded through Roman streets, chained and humiliated beneath his triumphal arch that would be his true victory. Not conquest, but spectacle. She would be forced to watch as the crowd jeered, as her children were displayed like spoils of war, as the gods of Egypt were mocked by senators drunk on vengeance. The idea turned her stomach to stone. Cleopatra bowed her head, feigning consideration. "I am grateful," she said softly. "But Egypt does not travel well. Its beauty dies in foreign air." Octavian studied her. He could see the mind behind the mask, calculating patience still dangerous. "Do not attempt escape," he warned. "I will guard you more closely than any treasure." When he left, the silence returned heavy, final. Cleopatra stood for a long while motionless, listening to the wind outside. Somewhere beyond the city walls, Roman soldiers drank and sang. Somewhere downriver, her son Caesarion was fleeing, carrying what was left of her dynasty. She prayed the gods would hide him well. Then she gave her final order. "Prepare the mausoleum," she told her servants. "Fill it with my treasures, the gold, the tapestries, the scrolls. Let it shine so brightly, they'll think I plan to live there." By evening, the palace was a theater again. Cleopatra dined with her closest attendants, Charmian and Olympos, as if nothing had changed. She laughed, drank wine, spoke of trivial things, the taste of figs, the shape of the moon, the way the Nile sounded at night. Only her eyes betrayed her. They were too calm. When the meal was over, she dismissed all but her 2 women. The mausoleum stood ready, torches flickering against its gold walls. In its center waited a low couch draped in silk, and beside it a small basket woven from reeds. Cleopatra touched the basket gently. Inside, coiled beneath fig leaves, was the instrument of her freedom, an asp, the sacred Egyptian cobra. Its scales gleamed like polished bronze. She had arranged it all with exquisite precision, a story, a symbol, a performance no Roman could rewrite. Her hands were steady as she sat upon the couch. "They will say I feared Rome," she said quietly to Charmian. "Let them. Fear is wiser than vanity." Iris knelt beside her, weeping. Cleopatra reached out and brushed the girl's tears away. "Do not mourn me," she said. "I am only returning to the gods who lent me this crown." Then, removing her diadem, she placed it gently upon her lap. The asp stirred, uncoiling its tongue, flickering like a whisper. Cleopatra extended her arm. For a heartbeat, nothing happened, and then a quick strike. A gasp escaped her lips, sharp, then soft. She leaned back, her breathing slowing. Her attendants, trembling, watched as color drained from her face. Still, she looked serene, almost radiant, as if the venom were simply carrying her home. Olympos found her minutes later. The queen lay still, her golden robe unwrinkled, her hand resting on the asp's basket. Charmian, barely standing, adjusted the diadem on her mistress's head. When the Roman guards burst in, she looked at them and said the last words history would remember her by, "Was this well done of Our Lady?" And without waiting for an answer, she fell beside her queen. When Octavian entered, he stopped. Even he, the man who had outweighted all rivals, could not help but admire the perfection of it. There she was, Cleopatra VII, last pharaoh of Egypt, lying in gold, and silence her beauty, untamed by death. He had planned a triumph. She had stolen it. Outside, the torches flickered in the wind. Somewhere along the river, the night carried the faint echo of frogs, the endless hum of the Nile. The empire would stretch its shadow farther than ever before, but in that small, still chamber, Rome had been denied its victory. Cleopatra had chosen her ending not as a prisoner, not as a spectacle, but as a sovereign, the last of the pharaohs, the last to rule her own fate. And as dawn crept over Alexandria, painting the marble with pale gold, the crown slipped slightly from her head and rolled onto the floor, the sound soft, final, and eternal. When the sun rose over Alexandria the next morning, it shone on a kingdom without a queen. The city, which had once awakened to the sound of hymns and harbors, now stirred in uneasy silence. Word spread like smoke: Cleopatra is dead. The streets filled with disbelief. Some said she had fled. Others swore she had become a goddess vanished into light. Only the palace guards knew the truth, and even they whispered it, as though speaking it aloud might summon her ghost. In the great hall of the mausoleum, Octavian stood among the treasures Cleopatra had chosen for her final stage. Gold gleamed in the torchlight. Silks rippled faintly in the heat. The queen herself lay on her bier, her face serene, her hands folded neatly upon her breast. For all his triumph, the young conqueror could not look at her long. She robbed Rome of its victory, one of his officers murmured. Octavian's reply was soft, almost grudging. No, she completed it. He ordered her body buried beside Antony's, despite Roman protests. Together, they caused enough trouble, he said dryly. Let them rest together now. It was meant as irony, but the act itself betrayed something else: respect, or perhaps unease. Even dead Cleopatra commanded attention. Her funeral was unlike any Alexandria had seen. There were no triumphal banners, no Roman horns, only the slow procession of priests chanting prayers to Isis as they carried her coffin toward the royal necropolis. The people lined the streets, heads bowed, some weeping openly. Petals rained from balconies. The air smelled of myrrh and salt, and when the last drumbeat faded, the kingdom she had built for 2 decades finally exhaled. The Ptolemaic dynasty, born in the wake of Alexander the Great, ended that day. Egypt, proud, ancient, unbroken for 3,000 years, became a Roman province. The twin crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, once the symbol of divine rule, were carried away to adorn a foreign triumph. Octavian left the city in Roman order. He installed administrators, imposed taxes, seized the treasury, a king's ransom of gold, jewels, and manuscripts. The library, though damaged, remained a shell of its old glory. The priests were instructed to continue their rituals for stability's sake, but everyone knew the gods had gone quiet. And yet, amid this bureaucratic victory, small mercies endured. At Cleopatra's request, carried out through loyal servants, her children were spared, at least for a time. The twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, along with their younger brother Ptolemy Philadelphus, were sent to Rome under Octavian's protection. They would walk, bewildered in his triumphal parade, dressed in golden chains, before crowds who cheered their mother's death. Of Caesarion, her firstborn, the son of Julius Caesar, there was no such mercy. Cleopatra had sent him south toward Nubia before her death, but Octavian's spies were relentless. They captured the boy soon after, and when a counselor suggested sparing him, Octavian answered with chilling logic. There is too much Caesar in him. He was executed quietly. His name struck from every record. The bloodline of Alexander and the pharaohs ended not with thunder, but with silence. In the weeks that followed, Alexandria changed. The city that had been the beating heart of the Greek East turned inward, subdued. Statues of Cleopatra and Antony were removed or recarved to resemble Roman deities. The great coins bearing her face were melted down and reminted with Octavian's Augustus Caesar, as he would soon call himself. Even time itself shifted: new calendars, new governors, new gods of marble instead of flesh. But memory is stubborn. The people of Egypt, who had bowed to pharaohs longer than Rome had existed, whispered her name in secret. Fishermen left lotus flowers by the riverbank. Temple maidens sang prayers to Isis that sounded suspiciously like songs of mourning for their queen. To them, she was not dead, but returned to the gods. They said her spirit rode the moonlight over the Nile, that the shimmer on the water each evening was the hem of her robe. And perhaps it was. In Rome, Octavian's triumph was spectacular. Cleopatra's image, carved in wax and draped in jewels, was paraded through the streets as symbol of submission. The crowd cheered, unaware that the real woman had denied them the satisfaction of spectacle. Behind the pageantry, Octavian knew it too. He had won the world, but she had chosen her own ending, and in doing so, escaped him. Years later, Cleopatra Selene, her surviving daughter, would grow up in exile under the care of Octavian's sister, Octavia. She inherited her mother's intelligence, her poise, and her ability to make empires uneasy. When she married King Juba II of Mauritania, She built a new Alexandria on the African coast, filling it with art and libraries, gardens, and gold. In that faraway place, her mother's dream of a kingdom ruled by knowledge and grace flickered to life again, if only for a time. As for Egypt, it never truly forgot. The temples continued their prayers, the river its rhythm. The Romans ruled, yes, but they ruled through Cleopatra's systems, her taxes, her laws, her scholars. The empire that claimed to have conquered her could not help but live off the legacy she left behind. And so the house of Ptolemy ended, but Egypt endured, transformed, assimilated, yet forever carrying her echo. Every flood of the Nile was said to be her sigh. Every lotus that bloomed on its banks, a memory of her defiance. For empires rise by conquest, but they endure by culture, and that Cleopatra had given the world in abundance. When night fell, the sea outside, Alexandria shimmered with phosphorescent light, a soft glow rippling in the dark water. Sailors whispered that it was the spirit of the queen herself sailing eternally down the river she had loved, wearing her crown of stars. The house of Ptolemy had fallen, but the woman who ended it had already stepped beyond history, into legend, into eternity, into the endless hush of the Nile. Empires are strange things. They devour the past, then quietly inherit it. And so it was with Rome and Egypt. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, conquered Cleopatra's world only to find himself haunted by it. He carried her ghost home like a shadow stitched to his triumph. Rome celebrated. The Senate declared him savior of the Republic. The crowds cheered his name. But in the halls of marble power, whispers followed the queen of the Nile, the witch of the East, the woman who tamed two Caesars. She was supposed to be gone, yet she lived on in conversation, rumor, and fear, an eternal reminder that there had once been a woman who defied Rome and nearly won. The irony was exquisite. The empire that mocked her luxury soon adopted her culture. Egyptian gold gilded Roman temples. Cleopatra's scientists and architects were absorbed into imperial service. Even her perfumes, those alchemical blends of myrrh and lotus, became the fashion of the Roman elite. The same senators who once called her decadent now burned her oils in their villas, trying to bottle a little of her legend. Augustus himself was more cautious. He erased her name from official decrees, ordered her statues destroyed or recarved, and forbade any public mourning. He wanted her forgotten, not out of hatred, but out of fear that memory might be contagious. And yet the harder Rome tried to silence her, the louder she echoed. Roman poets couldn't resist her. Virgil hinted at her in the Aeneid, the foreign queen who fought Rome's destined empire. Horace described her death with grudging admiration. She did not tremble before the sword. She took the poison boldly, as no woman's heart had ever dared. Even her enemies could not write her small. Cleopatra had become myth, and myths have no masters. Meanwhile, Egypt, though conquered, was reshaped in her image. Augustus appointed a prefect to rule in his name, but he preserved her bureaucratic systems. The census, the irrigation controls, the temples she restored. The queen's administrative brilliance was simply too efficient to replace. Her scholars remained at the library. Her priests kept the old rituals alive, though now the prayers included a token nod to the emperor. Alexandria itself thrived under Rome's uneasy admiration. The harbor bustled again, the great lighthouse still blazed at night, and philosophers debated in the colonnades as if their queen had only stepped out for a walk. But the tone had changed. Egypt was no longer a sovereign kingdom. It was the empire's jewel, polished but owned. And yet, Cleopatra's presence lingered not in politics, but in style. Roman matrons began to paint their eyes with kohl, to braid their hair in coils like hers, to wear jewelry of lapis and turquoise. Egyptian motifs crept into Roman architecture, lotus capitals, winged suns, even obelisks hauled across the sea to stand in the emperor's squares. Rome believed it had conquered the Nile, but slowly, quietly, the Nile was conquering Rome. Even in death, Cleopatra understood something. The men of marble did not conquest, is temporary. Fascination is eternal. A generation later, travelers to Alexandria would still ask where she was buried. The locals pointed toward a quiet tomb near the sea, long since sealed. Some said the waves touched it at high tide, carrying whispers into the chamber so the queen could still hear her river. Others claimed her body had dissolved into myth entirely, that she lived now in the moon's reflection on the water, smiling faintly at those who still spoke her name. Her children's fate scattered like petals on the wind. Caesarion was gone, but Cleopatra Selene, married off to Juba II in Mauritania, turned exile into empire. She built temples patterned after those of her mother libraries in her name, and a palace whose courtyards smelled of the same Egyptian perfumes. On her coins, she placed a crescent moon beside her crown, half tribute, half inheritance. The daughter of Cleopatra, they called her. Even in a foreign land, that name commanded awe. Back in Rome, artists could not resist painting Cleopatra's death, the serpent at her breast, her eyes half closed in serene defiance. The more Augustus tried to make her a cautionary tale, the more she became a legend of autonomy. She was no longer a queen or a lover. She was a symbol of power, claimed of intelligence, weaponized of beauty that refused apology. Centuries later, Roman emperors themselves would imitate her theater. They took her language of divinity, her pageantry of power, her use of light and spectacle. The man who destroyed her, Augustus, ended up ruling like her. He built temples to himself, wrapped his rule in religious imagery, and declared that he brought peace to a world at war. It was as if Cleopatra's ghost had tutored him in how to make mortality look eternal. History, ever the comedian, smiled. In time, her story drifted across generations. Greek chroniclers called her cunning. Roman historians called her wicked. Arab poets called her wise. The Middle Ages reduced her to a cautionary figure. The Renaissance resurrected her as muse. Every age reimagined her, but none could ignore her. She had become what she always sought unforgettable. And perhaps that was her truest victory. Rome would outlive her by centuries, but it would one day crumble into ruins, its palaces overgrown, its emperors forgotten. Yet Cleopatra's name still shone in every language the empire had ever conquered. She had built nothing eternal in stone. She had built it in memory. And somewhere beyond all those crumbling empires, in the endless hush of the Egyptian night, the Nile still rolled on moonlit and unbothered, carrying its silt and stories to the sea. Travelers said that if you stood by the river long enough, you could almost hear her voice in the reeds, calm, amused, utterly unconquered. I am still here, it seemed to say, and I always will be. Time, that most merciless of chroniclers, softened her image but never erased it. Centuries passed, empires rose, fell, and borrowed from her as if she were a library rather than a woman. And perhaps she was, for Cleopatra had never ruled only through armies or gold, but through knowledge. Long after her crown had turned to dust, her intellect still echoed in the systems that governed both Egypt and Rome. Even in defeat, her administrative genius endured. The Roman governors who replaced her soon discovered that the Nile obeyed no one who didn't understand it. They adopted her tax codes, irrigation records, and grain quotas almost word for word. Her census system, precise, equitable, and bilingual, became the backbone of Roman Egypt for 3 centuries. Cleopatra had designed governance as if it were a form of mathematics. pragmatic, humane, resistant to chaos. Rome, practical as ever, simply renamed it and called it progress. Her library scholars, spared by Octavian for their usefulness, continued to copy and translate the manuscripts she had collected. Under her patronage, Greek and Egyptian sciences had intertwined medicine, astronomy, engineering, forming a kind of intellectual syncretism that Rome quietly absorbed. The great physicians of the imperial age would cite Alexandrian treatises written in her time. Roman architects would borrow Egyptian symmetry without even realizing they were invoking her city's style. And her fascination with chemistry, what she called the science of scent and transformation, survived in unexpected ways. The formulae she had commissioned for perfumes, dyes, and cosmetics traveled across empires. In Roman marketplaces, the perfumed oils called unguenta Cleopatra fetched small fortunes, each vial claiming to capture the essence of the queen's allure. It was commerce as afterlife, the economy of memory. But perhaps her most enduring legacy was linguistic. Cleopatra had understood that language was the first empire. By mastering not only Greek and Latin, but Egyptian and Hebrew, she had made diplomacy personal. The Romans who came after her inherited this lesson. Their emperors would later demand that provincial governors learn the tongues of their subjects, a practice unprecedented before her. To rule hearts, she had once said one must first speak them. The scholars who came after her could not help but feel her presence. The astronomers of Alexandria continued to chart the heavens using her royal observatory. Centuries later, when Claudius Ptolemy, the great mathematician, compiled his Almagest, he drew from star charts preserved under her reign. The irony was exquisite. The most famous Ptolemy in scientific history owed his name and foundation to the last of the Ptolemies who had ruled. Even theology bore her imprint. Her fusion of Greek and Egyptian divinity of Isis and Aphrodite, of Osiris and Dionysus, helped birth a new religious language of empathy and salvation. It was this syncretic soil, scholars note, into which Christianity later took root. Cleopatra had woven together gods who loved gods, who suffered gods, who redeemed. When later priests spoke of divine compassion, they were repeating the vocabulary she had normalized. Her influence also lingered in how rulers imagined themselves. The Roman emperors who succeeded Augustus learned to perform sovereignty the way she had, not merely as administration, but as art. They built palaces that staged their divinity-used ceremony as narrative and sculpted their portraits to show eternal calm. They were, in a sense, Cleopatra's pupils' men, ruling with the theatricality of a woman they had claimed to despise. In Egypt itself, her memory mutated into myth. The priests of Isis folded her name into their liturgies. Storytellers claimed that she had not died, but ascended into the sky, her spirit becoming the bright star that rose over the Nile each spring. Children recited tales of the clever queen who tricked even Rome into respecting her. In a world stripped of its independence, she became a national memory defiance disguised as devotion. Even in far-off lands, scholars invoked her as a symbol of intellect. In medieval Arab chronicles, she was Cleopatra al-Hakima, Cleopatra the Wise. She was credited with treatises on alchemy, medicine, and the art of ruling. They imagined her not as temptress, but as scientist and philosopher. Perhaps they saw what the Romans could not, that a woman who ruled by thought alone was more dangerous than any legion. By the time the Renaissance rediscovered her, her legend had taken every shape: lover, queen, witch, saint, scholar. Artists painted her death as erotic martyrdom. Playwrights wrote her speeches as poetry. Philosophers admired her as the final echo of Hellenistic genius. But beneath every retelling, one truth endured: that knowledge once kindled cannot be conquered. For that was Cleopatra's real empire. Not Egypt, not Rome, not even the Nile, but the human desire to understand, to imagine, to endure through intellect. The systems she built were not monuments of stone, but of thought resilient enough to survive every conquest. Somewhere in the dust of Alexandria's ruins, archaeologists still find fragments of her era, a ledger marked in Greek, and Demotic, a bronze astrolabe, a bottle of scented oil sealed tight against time. Each piece is small, almost trivial, yet together they whisper her story. Not the scandal, not the romance, but the mind. The scholar queen, the philosopher Pharaoh, the woman who measured power, not in soldiers, but in sentences. She had once told a Roman envoy, half smiling, when swords rust scrolls still speak. 2,000 years later, they still do. 2 millennia later, her name is still the most famous in history, to end with a sigh, Cleopatra. Not Caesar, not Antony, not Augustus, Cleopatra. It rolls off the tongue like a whisper, half prophecy, half perfume. And yet few of the millions who know it know the woman behind it. History, written by her conquerors, turned her into an optical illusion. Rome, in its victory, could not bear the thought that a woman, and an Eastern one at that, had nearly undone it. So they rewrote her as warning, not wonder. They took her intellect and renamed it, cunning her diplomacy, and called it deceit, her self-command, and called it witchcraft. To Roman historians like Plutarch and Cassius Dio, Cleopatra was not a leader, but a lesson the fatal woman, the siren who lured great men to their doom. They wrote of feasts and perfumes, of jewels dissolving in vinegar, of ships gilded in gold and voices dripping with honey. They loved her extravagance because it excused her defiance. A woman too clever was a threat, but a woman too indulgent that Rome could laugh at. And so, the centuries misremembered her. The West inherited a version painted in scandal, a caricature of seduction, not strategy. Medieval moralists made her a warning to women about vanity. Renaissance painters made her an emblem of beauty undone by love. Shakespeare turned her into poetry, magnificent, yes, but tragic, because she loved too much. What they all forgot was that Cleopatra loved power, not as conquest, but as craft. She had studied how it moved, how it spoke, how it survived. She had wielded it as gracefully as others wielded swords. Her so-called lovers were not trophies, but alliances carefully chosen, mutually beneficial, and fully controlled until the world collapsed around them. In truth, she had been Rome's equal, and that was her sin. For centuries, scholars argued over her origins, her language, even her appearance, as if her skin tone or ancestry could explain her genius. She was Greek by blood, Egyptian by choice, cosmopolitan by instinct. Her beauty, if the few surviving busts are to be believed, was not the ethereal perfection of myth, but something sharper, a face alive with wit, humor, and command. It was her presence, not her profile, that conquered. Then came modern archaeology, and the myths began to crack. Excavations at Alexandria and Taposiris Magna unearthed coins, statues, and fragments of papyrus that told a different story, not of decadence, but of discipline. They revealed a queen, fluent in politics, economics, and science. They showed her as the last flame of Hellenistic intellect, not its ruin. Coins minted under her reign show her not as a goddess of beauty, but as a sovereign of authority. Strong nose, intelligent eyes, a jaw that suggests resolve. She wanted to be remembered not as fantasy, but as fact. Rome had turned her into symbol. History was slowly returning her to substance. In the 20th century, a quieter kind of rediscovery began. Historians, especially women, began reading the records, not for what they said, but for what they feared to say. They saw in Cleopatra's so-called bewitchments The familiar pattern of every powerful woman's story competence, rewritten as corruption, charisma, recast as manipulation. The more we uncovered, the more she reassembled herself. Her command of language, her financial acumen, her reforms in agriculture and taxation, all evidence of a ruler who understood her kingdom as both organism and idea. She had inherited a dying dynasty and made it shine one last time, transforming Egypt into the jewel of the ancient world. And yet, she had always been more than Egypt. She was civilization itself, arguing with its conquerors, art against empire, intellect against brute ambition. The Romans won the world, but she won the imagination. Each age made her its mirror. The Victorians turned her into moral fable. Hollywood made her a spectacle of excess. Modern feminists reclaimed her as strategist and survivor. But the truth lies somewhere between myth and marble. Cleopatra was not merely the woman who died for love. She was the woman who lived for sovereignty. In 1969, an archaeologist working near the harbor of Alexandria found shards of ancient glass fused by fire remnants, perhaps of the warehouse that held her fleet. Under magnification, the glass shimmered like captured lightning. Even her ruin is luminous, he wrote. He could not have known how accurate that line would prove. Today, scholars search for her tomb, a quest as much spiritual as archaeological. Some say it lies beneath the modern city, others near the temple of Taposiris Magna, where statues of Isis still stand, watch over the sea. Wherever it is, the earth keeps her secret well. Perhaps she wanted it that way, because what Cleopatra understood better than any ruler of her age, perhaps better than any since, was that mystery endures longer than monuments. Rome built marble to remember itself, and it crumbled. Cleopatra built fascination, and it has never faded. She remains what she always was, unclassifiable. Greek by birth, Egyptian by soul woman, by accident, monarch by design, scholar, ruler, performer, diplomat, mother myth. The world has spent 2,000 years trying to define her, and in failing has proven her genius again. For in the end, she achieved what even Caesar could not: immortality without empire. And somewhere beneath the silt and silence of the Nile Delta, the queen of two worlds still sleeps her story, alive not in stone, but in the pulse of every question we still ask about her. Night falls on the Nile, the way it has fallen for 5,000 years, slow, patient, inevitable. The water turns the color of polished bronze, then black glass. Palm leaves whisper in the dusk. Somewhere, a heron lifts from the reeds with the heavy grace of an omen, and the air smells faintly of mud, myrrh, and memory. This is where Cleopatra's story truly belongs, not in marble ruins or Roman scrolls, but here where the river meets the stars. For though her crown has long turned to dust, the rhythm of her reign never left Egypt. Each flood of the Nile, each dawn over Alexandria, feels like a small echo of her defiance. The river has carried empires on its back: Persians, Greeks, Romans, caliphs, sultans, kings, and yet it remembers her. When the evening wind rises, sailors still claim they can hear a woman's voice singing softly above the waves, half lullaby, half lament. Some say she sings for Antony. Some say she sings for her children. But perhaps she sings for herself, for the girl who once stood on the same riverbank barefoot, watching the stars, dreaming of a world that could never contain her. Cleopatra was not the end of Egypt's greatness. She was its last flowering, its final blaze before the long twilight. And like all great flames, she illuminated even the darkness that consumed her. Rome won the war, but Egypt won the soul of history. For centuries after her death, travelers from every corner of the empire came to Alexandria, seeking knowledge, beauty, healing all gifts of the queen who had refused to live as anyone's ornament. The scholars she nurtured spread across the world. The scrolls she preserved became the roots of science, medicine, astronomy, and art. Her language of spectacle, the blending of beauty and authority, became the blueprint for every ruler who sought to command both minds and hearts. Even her death, serene and deliberate, became an instruction in power that there are ways to triumph even when you lose everything. Time has a way of simplifying the past. Cleopatra knew this. She once told a Greek tutor, "Men will remember me in whatever way pleases them. So I will give them too much to remember." And she did. Her story has been painted in gold, and venom sung as tragedy, and myth shaped and reshaped by those who could never truly understand her. But through all the noise, the real Cleopatra endures not the seductress, not the sorceress, not the sinner or saint, but the sovereign. The mind that learned languages as weapons, who negotiated with gods and generals alike, who built an identity larger than the men who tried to contain it. Somewhere under layers of silt and sea, her tomb remains undiscovered, perhaps forever. Archaeologists search, hoping for her face, her jewelry, her bones. But she would likely have smiled at that, amused by the idea that mortals think they can locate what has become part of the world itself. Because Cleopatra's truest tomb is not in stone. It is in the current of the Nile, in the whisper of papyrus leaves, in the glint of gold dust caught in the morning light. It is in the enduring fascination of those who speak her name. Every retelling is an offering, every question a hymn. Stand on the banks of the river long enough, and you will understand why the Egyptians believed time was a circle, not a line. The same wind that once filled the sails of her royal barge still moves through the reeds tonight. The same moon that lit her palace still casts silver across the water. Nothing has truly ended, it has only returned to rhythm. So the story of Cleopatra closes not with a death, but with a continuation, an endless current of memory flowing between myth and history. The empire that destroyed her is gone, but she remains in the marble of poets, the ink of scholars, the dreams of anyone who has ever refused to be ordinary. And if you listen closely, beneath the hum of the night insects and the soft sigh of the river, you might hear her voice, calm, ironic, eternal, drifting through the dark, like the Nile itself. I am still here. I always was, and I always will be. Completed.